There are few moments in the grim annals of the 41st millennium that reshape the very foundations of reality itself. The Imperium of man, that vast, sprawling domain of 1,000,000 worlds, had endured for 10,000 years upon a bedrock of carefully constructed truths. Yet even the mightiest fortress can crumble when its cornerstone proves to be built, not of stone, but of lies. The forge world of Zerion Prime had been lost to the warp storms for 3 centuries when the explorator vessel, Machinata's Will, finally broke through the roiling tempest that had claimed it. Tech Dominus Vallex 77 led the expedition into the tomb-silent factorums, his augmetic eyes scanning ruins that spoke of desperate final hours. The forges had gone cold, the servitors long since fallen to rust and decay. Yet something called to him from the deepest vaults, a signal so faint his cogitators barely registered its presence. In the lowest sub-basement, beneath layers of rockcrete and steel that had withstood orbital bombardment, Vallex 77 found it. The device was no larger than a man's torso, yet it pulsed with energies that made his optical mechadendrites recoil. Archaeotech of the Dark Age, undoubtedly. Its crystalline core flickered with patterns that hurt to perceive directly, and inscribed upon its obsidian surface were warnings in High Gothic and a dozen other languages. "Truth is the greatest heresy," read one. "Knowledge is damnation," proclaimed another. The Tech Dominus should have sealed the vault and reported his findings to Mars. The Omnissiah's teachings were clear about such discoveries. Yet the device whispered to him in languages his augmented brain could not quite pass, speaking of revelations that would shake the very pillars of the galaxy. Against every protocol burned into his cortex implants, Vallex 77 reached out with a trembling mechadendrite and touched the activation rune. The Veritas Vox awakened with a sound like reality tearing. Across the galaxy, every Voxcaster, every astropathic relay, every comlink and data slate suddenly blazed with a signal that could not be blocked, could not be silenced, could not be stopped. From the spires of Terra to the darkest underhive, from the bridge of the mightiest battleship to the humblest agri-world settlement, the same voice spoke with the authority of ages. "Citizens of the Imperium," the voice began, neither male nor female, but something altogether more ancient. "You have been lied to for 10,000 years. On Terra, High Lord Militant Ecclesiarch Desis VII dropped his chalice of blessed wine as the transmission overrode his private chambers, sanctified Vox. Across the throne world, billions of pilgrims froze in the midst of their devotions as the impossible words echoed from every shrine and cathedral. In the depths of the imperial palace, custodians reached for their guardian spears, yet their enemies were not made of flesh and could not be fallen by blade or bolt. The imperial truth, which your emperor proclaimed during the Great Crusade, was not truth at all. It was the greatest lie ever told to the human species. There are gods in the darkness beyond the stars. There are powers in the warp that feed upon mortal souls. Your ancestors knew this. Your emperor knew this. He chose to hide it from you. Lord Commander Dante of the Blood Angels stood upon the command deck of his battle barge as the transmission reached even the deepest reaches of space. His ancient features, scarred by a millennium of war, grew pale as the voice continued its inexorable revelation. Around him, serfs and space marines alike listened in stunned silence to words that rewrote everything they understood about their reality. The entities you call demons are not mere warp predators. They are the servants of beings so vast and terrible that the mere knowledge of their existence was deemed too dangerous for you to possess. Yet your ignorance has not protected you. It has made you vulnerable. For 10 millennia, these dark gods have fed upon the suffering your ignorance created, grown strong upon the despair your blindness fostered. Planetary Governor Maxime Val of Cadia stared at the Vox unit in his command bunker, as though it had become a venomous serpent. The fortress world had stood against the eye of terror for 10,000 years, its soldiers dying in the thousands to hold back tides of horror that the Imperium claimed were merely aberrant Xenos. Now the truth burned through the air like acid, and Val felt the weight of every lie he had told his soldiers, every false reassurance he had given to the families of the dead. Your emperor proclaimed that there were no gods, yet he himself had already made a pact with the very entities he denied. Upon Moloch, he walked into the realm of chaos and stole power from the gods themselves, the power that makes him eternal. The might that sustained him through the Great Crusade was bought with bargains made in darkness. Your God is a thief who stole divinity from devils. The transmission reached the farthest hive worlds, the most isolated agri-settlements, the deepest mining colonies carved into the hearts of dead moons. Workers stopped their labors, nobles fled their palaces, and children asked questions that their parents could not answer. In the underhives, gang leaders who had whispered of dark powers in hidden shrines suddenly found their heresies vindicated by a voice that spoke with absolute authority. Tech Dominus Valek 77 watched in mounting horror as the device continued its broadcast. He had expected knowledge, perhaps even forbidden lore, that would advance his understanding of the Omnissiah. He had not expected this systematic dismantling of everything the Imperium claimed to believe. His trembling fingers reached for the deactivation rune, yet something stayed his hand. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the growing certainty that the galaxy would never be the same again, regardless of what he chose to do. The imperial truth was designed not to enlighten, but to control. By denying the existence of gods, your emperor sought to starve them of worship. Yet in doing so, he created something worse than devotion. He created ignorance, and ignorance, in a universe where knowledge is power and truth is survival, became the greatest weapon ever forged against your own species. Across 1,000,000 worlds, the reaction was as varied as humanity itself. Some citizens fell to their knees in despair, their worldview shattered beyond repair. Others raged against the voice, declaring it the vilest heresy ever spoken. Still others felt a terrible sense of relief, as though a weight they had carried unknowingly for their entire lives had finally been lifted from their shoulders. In the depths of space, Astropath screamed and collapsed, as the psychic resonance of the revelation tore through the warp like a blade. For 10,000 years, you have been told that faith in the Emperor protects. This too is a lie built upon a foundation of truth. It is not faith that protects you from the darkness. It is knowledge. It is understanding. It is the willingness to face the horrible reality of your universe rather than hide behind comfortable deceptions. Your emperor knew this. That is why he kept the truth for himself and his chosen few, while feeding you the poison of ignorance. The transmission paused, and in that silence, the galaxy held its breath. Somewhere in the background of the signal, Valek 77 could hear something like weeping, or perhaps laughter. The device itself had begun to smoke, its ancient mechanisms straining under the weight of what they were broadcasting. Yet still it continued, driven by a purpose that had been encoded into its very structure during humanity's golden age. The Great Crusade was not a war to reunite humanity. It was a war to gather enough psychic mass to fuel your emperor's ascension to godhood. Every world conquered, every population brought under imperial rule, added to the vast reservoir of souls that would eventually sustain him upon the golden throne. You were never citizens. You were always cattle, bred and herded for the defeat that was to come. The words struck the galaxy like a plague, spreading faster than any disease through the interconnected network of Imperial communication. Vox operators tried desperately to cut the signal, only to find their equipment had become conduits for something beyond their understanding. On Mars, the Fabricator General himself led a conclave of tech priests in desperate prayer to the Omnissiah, yet their binary cant was drowned out by the relentless revelation that poured from every speaker and data port on the Red Planet. Yet even as the truth burned through the void, burning away 10 millennia of careful deception, the galaxy's response began to take shape. Some worlds declared the transmission to be the ultimate test of faith and condemned any who gave credence to its words. Others saw in it the confirmation of doubts they had harbored in silence for years. Still others began to ask the question that would reshape the Imperium forever. If the imperial truth was a lie, what else had they been deceived about? The Veritas Vox continued its broadcast, indifferent to the chaos it had unleashed, for it was only the beginning. Truth, once unleashed, could not be contained, and the galaxy was about to learn just how deep the deception had truly run. The first crack in the foundation had appeared. Soon, the entire edifice would begin to fall. The silence that followed the Veritas Vox's first revelation lasted less than a heartbeat before the device resumed its inexorable broadcast. Across the galaxy, billions of souls who had just learned that their universe contained gods of darkness now braced themselves for truths they could not yet imagine. Yet even the most cynical among them were unprepared for what came next. "Your Emperor sits upon the golden throne," the ancient voice continued, each word falling like hammer blows upon the anvil of faith. "You have been taught that this device sustains his divine essence, that it preserves the master of mankind for all eternity. This is not salvation. This is the most exquisite torment ever devised." Cardinal Vex of the Shrine, World Ophelia VII, clutched his Aquila pendant so tightly that the ceramite cut into his palm. Around him, 10,000 pilgrims who had travelled across the sector to reach the Cathedral of the Emperor's Light stood frozen in the courtyard. Their faces, moments before, radiant with religious fervour, had become masks of creeping horror. The Golden Throne does not preserve your Emperor. It ends him. Every moment of every day for 10,000 years it has been ending him. The machine tears his soul apart, piece by piece, only to watch it regenerate through the power of his perpetual nature, so that the process can begin anew. Death and rebirth, an endless cycle of agony that no mortal mind could comprehend. On Terra itself, within the halls of the Adeptus Ministorum, High Lord Desis felt his hearts skip in their rhythm. The sacred texts spoke of the Emperor's sacrifice, of his willing acceptance of eternal vigil to protect humanity from the darkness. They did not speak of this. They could not have spoken of this. For what mortal tongue could give voice to such horror? Your prayers do not reach a benevolent God-Emperor watching over his children. They reach a screaming body, a being torn between life and death every second of his existence. When you pray for his protection, you petition a consciousness shattered by 10 millennia of unending torment. When you sing his praises, you celebrate the suffering of the one soul who deserves peace more than any other in the galaxy. The revelation struck the shrine worlds like an orbital bombardment. On Hagia, where the Cathedral Astragarium had stood for 8,000 years, Canoness Superior Ludmilla watched her battle sisters fall to their knees as the broadcast echoed through their vox beads, Some wept openly. Others began to tear at their holy vestments, as though the symbols had become brands against their flesh. The custodians know. They have always known. As they stand their eternal watch in the throne room, they do not guard a sleeping God. They witness an endless condemned, a divine violence committed fresh with every passing moment. Their silence is not reverence. It is complicity in the greatest atrocity ever perpetrated. Tec Dominus Valak 77, still standing before the Veritas Vox on the dead Forge world, felt his augmetic systems strain as they processed the implications. His mind, part flesh and part machine, attempted to reconcile what he was hearing with everything he had been taught about the Omnissiah's grand design. The calculations would not resolve. The logic trees collapsed into paradox and madness. The device that holds your emperor was built not by love, but by desperation. When Horus wounded him mortally upon the vengeful spirit, the emperor faced a choice. He could die as a man and pass into whatever lies beyond death's veil, or he could accept eternal torment in service to the species that had betrayed him. He chose torment, not for glory, not for worship, but because he could not bear to see humanity fall into darkness without him. Across the galaxy, astropaths screamed in unison as the psychic resonance of the revelation tore through the warp. Some collapsed, their minds unable to process the cosmic injustice they had just learned. Others began to weep tears of blood as they felt, for the first time, the true anguish that powered their ability to communicate across the void. Every message they had ever sent, every psychic light they had ever kindled, had been fueled by the Emperor's pain. The Golden Throne's machine spirit is not artificial intelligence. It is consciousness itself, a fragment of your Emperor's psyche that was separated from the whole and enslaved to operate the device. Part of him watches as the rest of him dies, forced to be the instrument of his own endless condemned. Imagine that agony. Imagine being forced to violence yourself for 10,000 years while remaining fully aware of every moment of suffering you inflict. On the hive world of Necromunda, in the deepest levels of the underhive, where even the Arbites feared to tread, gang leaders who had spent their lives mocking the body emperor found their blasphemies turned to ash in their mouths. They had thought themselves clever for seeing through imperial propaganda, for recognizing that their god was dead. They had not imagined that death itself could be turned into an instrument of torment. When the Golden Throne fails, as it must eventually fail, your emperor will not die. He will explode. 10 millennia of compressed agony, of accumulated psychic trauma, will detonate like a star-going nova. Terror will be consumed. The warp storms that follow will make the opening of the eye of terror seem like a gentle breeze. Your Emperor's liberation will herald the end of everything you have ever known. The broadcast reached the furthest edges of Imperial space, carried by signals that bypassed every security protocol and override system. On the eastern fringe, where Tau expansion fleets probed Imperial borders, human auxiliaries working for the greater good suddenly understood why their former countrymen fought with such desperate fury. They were not defending an empire. They were maintaining a torment chamber. Cardinal Vex tried to speak, to offer some word of comfort to the pilgrims who looked to him for guidance, but his throat had closed with horror. Around him, the faithful began to react in ways that 10,000 years of religious conditioning had not prepared them for. Some fell prostrate, begging forgiveness from their tormented God. Others stood and walked away in silence, their faith not destroyed, but transformed into something else entirely. Still others began to laugh, the sound high and terrible in the cathedral's vaulted spaces. The Astronomicon, that great light in the warp that guides your ships through the darkness, is powered by his pain. Every time you travel between the stars, every time you navigate by his beacon, you use the Emperor's suffering as your guide. The light that brings you home is the visible manifestation of the greatest injustice in the history of the galaxy. Tech-adept Morzan of Forge World. Lucius dropped his plasma cutter as the revelation reached even the depths of the tech vaults. Around him, servitors continued their labors, unaware that the fundamental nature of their existence had just been redefined. But the humans, the precious few baseline humans who still worked alongside the Mechanicus, stared at each other with dawning comprehension. If this was true, if their emperor suffered such torment, then every prayer they had offered, every moment of worship they had given, had been acts of cruelty rather than devotion. Your ecclesiarchy speaks of martyrdom, of the glorious sacrifice made by saints and heroes in the emperor's name. Yet none of them, not even Sebastian Thor himself, endured a fraction of what your God experiences every moment of his existence. The greatest martyrs in Imperial history lived and died in paradise compared to the hell that is the Golden Throne. The words reached even the Space Marines, those transhuman warriors who had been conditioned to feel no doubt, no fear, no wavering in their faith. Captain Thaddeus of the Ultramarines. Third Company stood in the chapel of his strike cruiser and felt something crack inside his chest. It was not his faith breaking, but rather transforming into something harder and more terrible than it had been before. If the Emperor suffered such agony for their sake, then no sacrifice they could make would ever be sufficient to repay the debt. 10,000 years ago, your species made a choice. You chose to preserve one soul in eternal torment, rather than face the darkness without him. Every day since, that choice has been renewed. Every psyker fed to the throne, every prayer offered in his name, every war fought for his glory, maintains the machine that keeps your God screaming. You are all complicit. You have all been made criminals of the being you worship most. The revelation thundered across shrine worlds and fortress monasteries, through the halls of the ecclesiastical palace, and into the deepest meditation chambers of the Space Marine chapters. Faith did not die in that moment, but it changed. Some who heard the truth fell into despair so complete that they could not function. Others felt their devotion crystallize into something approaching madness, a determination to suffer any fate if it might someday ease their emperor's torment. Yet perhaps the most terrible aspect of the revelation was its logical consistency. Every aspect of imperial dogma suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through this lens of cosmic injustice. The emperor's silence, explained as holy mystery, became the silence of unending agony. His need for sacrifice, framed as divine hunger, revealed itself as the price of maintaining the most elaborate torment device ever conceived. On distant worlds, governors who had spent their lives enforcing imperial tithes suddenly understood what those tithes truly purchased. Not protection, not prosperity, not even simple survival. They bought the continuation of their God's suffering, the maintenance of a system so inherently unjust that it beggared description. The Veritas Vox paused again, and in that silence the galaxy began to process what it had learned. The Emperor was not dead, as some heretics claimed. He was not absent, as some doubters feared. He was present, aware, and screaming. Every prayer sent to him was a reminder of his torment. Every act of faith was a decision to perpetuate his agony. The truth was more terrible than any lie could ever be. And still, the broadcast continued, for there were darker secrets yet to be revealed. The galaxy reeled from the revelation of the Emperor's torment, yet the Veritas Vox allowed no respite, no time to process the cosmic injustice it had revealed. The ancient device pulsed with malevolent purpose as it prepared to deliver its next truth, one that would transform heroic sacrifice into industrial violence in the minds of countless families across the Imperium. The black ships that visit your worlds every century do not collect your psychers for training and service, the voice intoned, each word falling like the blade of an executioner's axe. They collect them for defeat. Your children with the gift of warp sight are not inducted into the Emperor's service. They are gathered to feed his endless hunger. On the agri-world of Demeter Prime, Magda Holst dropped the bundle of grain she had been carrying to the storage silos. Her hands trembled as she remembered the day, 15 years past, when the black ships had come for her daughter Katya. The child had shown signs of psychic awakening, moving objects with her mind and speaking of things that were not there. When the grey-armoured figures had taken her, Magda had wept tears of joy. Her daughter had been chosen to serve the God Emperor himself. 1,000 psychers die every day to sustain the body upon the Golden Throne. The broadcast continued, its mechanical precision making the horror all the more terrible. They are fed into the Emperor's presence, not as willing servants, but as screaming fuel. Their souls are torn apart to maintain the psychic barriers that keep his tormented essence from exploding and consuming terror itself. Across the hive world of Armageddon, where the recent wars had left entire hab blocks empty of children, the revelation struck like a second apocalypse. Mothers who had sent their psyker offspring away with pride learned that they had delivered them to an abattoir. Fathers who had boasted of their children's divine calling discovered that they had been accomplices to violence. Captain Mordian Thrace of the black ship Eternal Vigil stood on his command deck as the transmission echoed through his vessel's corridors. Around him, his crew of soul-sworn bondsmen continued their duties with mechanical precision. Yet he could see the doubt creeping into their eyes. In the ship's holds, 300 psychers waited in null chambers, bound for terror and the fate that awaited them there. Until this moment, Thrace had believed he was delivering them to glory. Now he knew he was their executioner's assistant. The Astronomicon, that great beacon that guides your ships through the warp, is powered by the mass sacrifice of 10,000 psychers arranged in a choir of the damned. They are not honored servants maintaining a sacred light. They are batteries, drained of life and soul until nothing remains but empty husks. The strongest among them endure for months. The weakest burn out in days, their consciousness scattered across the warp like ash on a nuclear wind. On Terra itself, in the chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, where the Adeptus Astronomica maintained their vigil, Tech-Adept Vauxhall 9 watched the psychers in his charge with new eyes. The men and women connected to the great psychic apparatus had always seemed peaceful to him, their faces serene as they channeled their life force through the Emperor's will. Now he noticed things he had ignored before. The way their eyes would flicker with terror in unguarded moments. The way some would mouth silent screams while their bodies remained perfectly still. The way newer inductees would sometimes weep without tears, their bodies too controlled by the apparatus to express their anguish fully. When the black ships arrive at a world, they sort your children like livestock. The strongest psychers, perhaps 1 in 100, are sent for training as astropaths or sanctioned psychers. These few will know service and honor, though even they will eventually be consumed by the roles they are forced to play. The rest the vast majority, are earmarked for immediate sacrifice. Your precious children are evaluated not for their potential, but for their utility as fuel. The words reached the shrine world of Ophelia VII, where Cardinal Vex still stood frozen in his cathedral courtyard. Among the pilgrims gathered, there were dozens of families who had made the journey to give thanks for their children's selection by the black ships. They had travelled across sectors, spent their life savings, endured hardships that would have broken lesser souls, all to express their gratitude for what they believed was their offspring's elevation to divine service. Now they learned that their gratitude had been for violence, their celebration a funeral they had never known they were attending. The process is efficient, mechanical, devoid of mercy or sentiment. The selected psychers are brought to Terra in holds designed not for comfort, but for preservation. They must arrive alive, for dead psychers provide no sustenance. Along the way, many go mad from the proximity to the warp and the psychic screams of the Emperor himself. These broken souls are still fed to the throne, their madness considered irrelevant to their function as fuel. Magda Holst sank to her knees in the grain field as the full implication struck her. Katya had not died in some glorious battle or noble sacrifice. She had been ended, slowly and deliberately, to maintain a system that kept their god in eternal torment. Every prayer Magda had offered for her daughter's success had been a prayer for her destruction. Every moment of pride she had felt had been built upon a foundation of cosmic injustice. The sorting chambers of Terra process thousands of psychers every week. Those deemed suitable for the Astronomicon are taken to the deep vaults beneath the Imperial Palace and connected to machinery that will drain them over the course of months. Those selected for the Emperor's direct sustenance are brought to the throne room itself, where they are dissolved psychically in his presence. Their last sensation is not glory or divine connection, but the infinite scream of the being they are dying to preserve. On the fortress world of Cardia, Governor Val found himself thinking of the thousands of young men and women his world had tithed over the millennia. Cardia was a world of soldiers, and its people had always accepted the necessity of sacrifice for the greater good. Yet this was not sacrifice in any meaningful sense. This was the systematic violence of the innocent to perpetuate a system of torment that benefited no one. The families of these sacrificed children are told that their offspring serve in the Emperor's most sacred duties. Letters are forged in their names, describing glorious service and divine purpose. These lies are necessary, because the truth would make recruitment impossible. No parent would willingly send their child to be consumed if they understood what awaited them. The revelation struck different worlds in different ways, yet everywhere the reaction was the same. On Valhalla, where the ice never melted and life was hard enough without cosmic injustice, veterans of the Imperial Guard began to speak in hushed tones of the psychers who had served alongside them. They remembered young men and women who had seemed wise beyond their years, who had spoken of darkness in the warp with the authority of those who had seen it firsthand. Now they understood why those psychers had always seemed so sad, why they had looked at their comrades with such pity. The Scholastica Psychana, the institution responsible for training sanctioned psychers, maintains detailed records of survival rates. These records are classified at the highest levels because they reveal the true scope of the defeat. For every psyker who survives training and goes on to serve the Imperium, 50 others die in the process. The training itself is designed to kill the weak, for only those who can endure systematic psychological torment are deemed suitable for the slightly less horrific fate of active service. Captain Thrace walked among his ship's holding cells, looking at the faces of the psychers imprisoned there. They were young, most of them, barely past childhood. Some stared at the walls with the vacant expression of those who had already begun to retreat into madness. Others pressed against the bars, begging to know what would happen to them. Until today, Thrace had told them they would serve the Emperor with honor. Now he could not bring himself to speak at all. The industrial scale of this violence is staggering. Every day, across the galaxy, approximately 1,400 psychers die to maintain the Imperium's most basic functions. This is not counting those who die in training, those who are condemned for showing insufficient loyalty, or those who are simply deemed unsuitable for any purpose and killed out of hand. The true number of psychic murders committed in the Emperor's name approaches 500,000 souls every year. The number struck the galaxy like a thunderbolt. 500,000. Every year. For 10,000 years. The mathematics were simple enough for any citizen to understand, yet the implications were so vast that most minds simply refuse to process them. 5 billion psychers had died to maintain the current system. 5 billion souls, most of them children, fed into a machine designed to perpetuate their god's torment. On the hive world of Necromunda, in the depths where imperial law barely penetrated, gang leader Crackskull Gareth laughed until tears streamed down his scarred face. He had spent his life mocking the body emperor and the fools who worshipped him, yet even in his wildest blasphemies, he had never imagined anything as perfectly evil as the truth. The Imperium had built a system so comprehensively horrific that it made his own violence seem merciful by comparison. The families who celebrate their children's selection by the black ships are celebrating and condemned. The communities that hold festivals when the grey vessels depart are holding funeral rites for the living. The priests who bless the chosen psychers are pronouncing death sentences upon the innocent. All of this is done with full knowledge of the Adeptus Ministorum, the Inquisition, and the High Lords of Terror themselves. Magda Holst stood slowly, her legs shaking with the effort. Around her, the grain field stretched to the horizon, golden and peaceful in the afternoon light. Yet all she could see was her daughter's face on the day the black ships had come. Katya had been frightened, but trying to be brave, trusting that her parents would not let anything truly terrible happen to her. The memory of that trust now cut deeper than any blade. When psychers die to feed the Emperor, their souls do not pass into whatever realm awaits the departed. They are consumed utterly, torn apart and absorbed to maintain the psychic barriers around his essence. There is no afterlife for these sacrificed children, no peace, no reunion with loved ones in death. They simply cease to exist, snuffed out like candles in a hurricane, so that their life force can be added to the great working that keeps the galaxy's greatest torturer alive. The broadcast paused, and in that silence, the galaxy began to count its dead. Every world had given up its psychers to the black ships. Every family had members who had vanished into the grey vessel's holds. Every community had celebrated sacrifices they had never understood were genuine murders. The scope of complicity was total, the weight of guilt universal. Yet perhaps the most terrible aspect of the revelation was its necessity. Without the daily sacrifice of psychers, the Emperor would die, and his death would consume Terra and shatter the Imperium. The system was evil beyond description, yet also seemingly impossible to abandon. They were all criminals, and they had no choice but to remain criminals forever. The Veritas Vox resumed its broadcast, indifferent to the anguish it had caused. There were more secrets yet to be revealed, more truths that would make the horror complete. The Feast of Souls continued, as it always had, as it always must, until the galaxy found the courage to let their tormented god die. The galaxy had barely begun to process the horror of industrial psycho-sacrifice when the Veritas Vox delivered its next revelation. This truth would not require citizens to imagine distant atrocities or contemplate cosmic injustices. This truth surrounded them, served them, and had been staring at them with vacant eyes their entire lives. The servitors that labor in your factories, serve in your homes, and maintain your infrastructure are not machines, the ancient voice declared, each word falling like the tolling of funeral bells. They are human beings. They were human beings who have been lobotomized, disfigured, and enslaved to serve as living tools. Every servitor you have ever seen was once someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved. On the forge world of Metallica, tech adept Zorian 12 froze in the middle of calibrating a plasma generator as the words echoed through his workshop. Around him, dozens of servitors continued their assigned tasks with mechanical precision, their flesh and metal forms moving in perfect synchronization with the factory's rhythm. He had worked alongside them for decades, treating them as sophisticated machinery. Now he noticed details he had trained himself to ignore, the way some servitors' eyes would track movement even when their heads remained perfectly still, the occasional facial tic that served no mechanical function, the soft sounds some made that were almost, but not quite, like weeping. The process begins with criminals sentenced to servitude, political dissidents who have spoken against imperial rule, or simply citizens deemed surplus to requirements by the administratum. The broadcast continued with clinical precision. These individuals are subjected to surgical lobotomy, chemical conditioning, and psychic modification, designed to strip away everything that makes them human, while preserving the basic motor functions needed for labor. Magos Dominus, cowl inferior of forge. World Lucius felt his augmetic hearts skip as he processed the implications. He had overseen the creation of thousands of servitors over the centuries, following protocols handed down from the earliest days of the Mechanicus. The procedures had always been described as the removal of consciousness, the transformation of worthless flesh into useful machinery. Yet the technical manuals had always contained warnings about incomplete neural severance, about the need for constant psychic dampening fields, about the occasional instances of behavioral anomalies that required immediate termination. The Adeptus Mechanicus teaches that the lobotomy process completely destroys consciousness, leaving nothing but biological machinery behind. This is a lie. Consciousness often survives the process, trapped inside a body that no longer obeys its commands. The personality, memories, emotions, and capacity for suffering remain intact, while the ability to express them is severed. Imagine being buried alive in your own flesh for decades, aware of everything happening around you, but unable to speak, unable to cry, unable to die. The revelation struck the industrial worlds like a plague of understanding. On Armageddon, where the recent wars had required massive servitor labor battalions to clear the rubble, Planetary Governor Hermann Strab found himself looking at the construction crews outside his palace with new eyes. The servitors moved with purpose and efficiency, their augmented limbs perfectly suited for heavy lifting and debris removal. Yet now he noticed the way some would pause for microseconds longer than necessary, the way their heads would turn toward sounds that had no relevance to their assigned tasks, the way some seemed to flinch when touched by their human overseers. The signs of retained consciousness are everywhere, hidden in plain sight by a willful blindness that spans the entire Imperium. Servitors who hesitate before following orders they find morally repugnant. Servitors who show subtle signs of recognition when encountering people from their past lives. Servitors who develop repetitive behaviors that serve no mechanical function but provide psychological comfort to their trapped consciousness. In the underhive of Necromunda, where servitor tended waste processing plants kept the upper levels from drowning in their own filth, gang leader Grex, Iron Tooth, Marcus stared at the dozen servitors working the filtration systems. One of them, a female unit with extensive cranial modifications, had always seemed familiar to him. Now he remembered why. 20 years ago, his sister Calla had been arrested by the Arbites for black market trading. She had vanished into the judicial system, her fate officially listed as penal servitude. He had assumed she was laboring in some distant prison facility. Looking at the servitor now, he noticed the same scar on her left hand that Calla had earned as a child, the same way of favoring her right side when lifting heavy objects. The creation of servitors requires specific expertise in neurosurgery, psychic conditioning, and cybernetic integration. This knowledge is jealously guarded by the Adeptus Mechanicus, who claim it is necessary to prevent the creation of thinking machines that might rebel against humanity. In truth, the complexity of the process serves to hide its true nature. If servitor creation were simple, too many tech priests would recognize what they were actually doing. The elaborate procedures, the ritual components, the sacred oils and incense all serve to disguise industrial torment as religious ceremony. Tec Dominus Valix 77, still standing before the Veritas Vox on the dead forge world of Xerion Prime, felt his optical mechadendrites tremble as the device's revelations struck close to his own experience. He had overseen servitor creation procedures countless times, following the rituals with perfect precision. Yet there had always been moments of doubt, occasions when a subject's vitals spiked at specific points in the procedure, suggesting awareness of what was being done to them. He had dismissed these signs as mere biological reflexes, meaningless responses from flesh that was being transformed into something higher. Now he understood that those spikes had been screams his instruments were too crude to interpret. The industrial scale of servitor production across the Imperium means that millions of human beings are currently trapped in mechanical bodies, aware of their condition, but unable to communicate their suffering. They serve in your homes, preparing your meals with hands that remember embracing loved ones. They maintain your vehicles with minds that recall their own dreams and ambitions. They guard your facilities with eyes that have watched their own humanity being systematically stripped away. On the hive world of Tertius, in the mid-levels where the merchant classes maintained their comfortable lives, Madame Valoris looked at her household servitors with growing horror. The unit that had prepared her breakfast for 15 years suddenly seemed less like a sophisticated appliance and more like a person trapped in a mechanical shell. She noticed for the first time the way it would sometimes pause while cooking, staring at ingredients with what she had previously dismissed as processing delays, but now recognized as possible memories of meals it had once prepared for its own family. The Mechanicus maintains that servitors require psychic dampening fields to prevent interference from warp entities. This is partially true, but the dampening serves another purpose. It suppresses the psychic screams of the trapped consciousness, preventing other psychers from detecting the spiritual agony that radiates from every servitor. Without these fields, the psychic emanations from servitor workshops would be detectable across entire sectors, revealing the true scope of the atrocity. The broadcast reached the Space Marine chapters, where servitors maintained the massive war machines and fortress monasteries that protected the Imperium's finest warriors. Captain Marcus of the Imperial Fists stood in the armory of his battle barge as servitors performed routine maintenance on bolters and chains wards. These particular units had been requisitioned from the local Adeptus Mechanicus facility decades ago. their origins lost in bureaucratic records. Yet now he wondered about the men and women they had once been. Had they been criminals deserving of punishment, or simply citizens whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the servitor quotas needed filling? The process of servitor creation is not reversible. Once the neural pathways have been severed and the cybernetic implants integrated, the subject cannot be restored to full humanity. Yet this does not mean they cannot suffer. The trapped consciousness experiences every moment of its mechanical existence, every order it is forced to obey, every indignity it must endure. Death would be a mercy, yet servitors are designed for longevity, their mechanical components maintained while their biological elements are sustained through chemical intervention. Across the galaxy, citizens began to examine the servitors in their midst with new eyes. Factory workers on Cadian munitions plants noticed the way some servitors would occasionally mouth words during their labors, silent communications that served no mechanical function. Administrators on agri-worlds observed servitors tending to crops with what seemed like unnecessary gentleness, as though they remembered caring for living things. Even on the most sophisticated forge worlds, where servitors were treated as sacred fusion of flesh and machine, tech priests began to notice behavioral patterns that suggested something more than mere programming. The signs of retained consciousness vary depending on the individual and the completeness of the lobotomy procedure. Some servitors show subtle emotional responses to music or familiar voices. Others demonstrate problem-solving abilities that exceed their programming parameters. Still others exhibit what can only be described as grief, a persistent melancholy that affects their efficiency and requires periodic psychological reconditioning to suppress. On Terra itself, in the halls of the Adeptus Administratum, Scribe Secundus Valen found himself staring at the servitor that had assisted him with data processing for the past 5 years. The unit was equipped with multiple ocular implants that allowed it to read dozens of documents simultaneously, its brain modified to process and categorize information at superhuman speeds. Yet Valen now noticed that when presented with certain types of documents, particularly those dealing with family separations or child welfare cases, the servitor would pause fractionally longer than its programming required. He had always attributed this to processing delays. Now he wondered if he was witnessing something that might be called compassion, a remnant of humanity struggling against its mechanical constraints. The Imperium's citizens are surrounded by slavery, so complete that the enslaved cannot even be recognized as human. Every day, millions of servitors perform the labor that keeps imperial society functioning, their trapped consciousness bearing witness to the civilization that condemned them to this fate. They maintain the weapons used to conquer worlds, prepare the food consumed by their former peers, and guard the facilities where new servitors are created from fresh victims. The revelation began to spark reactions across imperial space. On some worlds, citizens began gathering around servitor work details, searching for signs of retained humanity among the mechanical laborers. Others recoiled from servitors entirely, unable to bear the thought of being served by beings they now understood to be torment victims. Still others began to speak in hushed tones about the possibility of ending the servitors' suffering, though none yet dared to act on such thoughts. The tech priests who oversee servitor creation often develop psychological conditioning to cope with their role in this systematic torment. They are taught to view flesh as weakness and consciousness as inefficiency. Yet many struggle with doubt, particularly when working with subjects who remind them of people from their own past. These doubts are treated as spiritual failings, addressed through increased augmentation and psychological conditioning designed to suppress empathy. Tech Dominus Valek 77 felt something approaching despair as he recognized himself in the broadcast's description. How many times had he suppressed doubts about the servitor creation process? How many signs of retained consciousness had he dismissed as imagination or sentiment? The device before him continued its relentless revelation, indifferent to the psychological trauma it was inflicting on those who heard its truths. The servitor program represents perhaps the most complete violation of human dignity ever institutionalized by the Imperium. It transforms citizens into slaves who cannot even be acknowledged as enslaved. It creates a class of beings who suffer constantly, but cannot communicate their suffering. It turns the act of being served into an act of complicity with torment. Every meal prepared by household servitors, every task performed by industrial units, every guard duty carried out by security servitors is made possible by consciousness trapped in mechanical hell. The broadcast paused, allowing the galaxy to process what it had learned. Across 1,000,000 worlds, citizens looked at the servitors around them with new understanding. These were not machines. They were people, trapped and tormented, forced to serve the civilization that had destroyed their humanity while preserving their capacity to suffer. The Veritas Vox resumed its transmission, moving toward revelations that would make the servitor nightmare seem almost merciful by comparison. Yet for now, the galaxy grappled with the knowledge that they had been surrounded by the enslaved dead their entire lives, that every convenience of imperial civilization came at the cost of human consciousness trapped in mechanical shells. The flesh was weak, the Mechanicus taught, but the spirit, it seemed, was harder to kill than anyone had realized. The galaxy still reeled from the revelation of servitor slavery when the Veritas Vox prepared to deliver another truth that would shatter the foundations of imperial military mythology. This revelation would strike at the heart of every family that had proudly sent their sons and daughters to serve in the Emperor's armies, every community that had celebrated the heroic sacrifices of their local regiments. The Imperial Guard regiments that march across 1,000 battlefields are not the Emperor's finest, the ancient voice proclaimed, each word cutting through the void like a blade through flesh. They are expendable resources, valued less than the equipment they carry. Your children who serve in the Astra Militarum are not heroes defending humanity. They are ammunition, designed to be consumed in vast quantities to achieve objectives that could be accomplished through other means at far lesser cost. On the fortress world of Cardia, Governor Maxim Val felt his blood turn to ice as the words echoed through his command bunker. Cadia had provided more regiments to the Imperial Guard than perhaps any other world in the galaxy. Generation after generation of Cadian youth had marched off to war with pride, carrying the purple and silver of their homeworld to battles across the stars. The families left behind had taken comfort in the knowledge that their loved ones served with honor, that their sacrifice meant something in the grand struggle against the darkness. The casualty reports filed by Imperial Guard commanders paint a different picture than the ones sent to grieving families. The broadcast continued with mechanical precision. Internal communications revealed the true scope of losses, the actual strategic value of operations, and the casual disregard with which human life is squandered. Battles described to the public as glorious victories were often catastrophic defeats. Heroic last stands were frequently unnecessary devastation ordered by commanders who had better options available. Colonel Marcus Kellen of the Valhallan 597th Ice Warriors stood in his regimental command post, staring at the Voxcaster as though it had become a venomous serpent. He had fought in dozens of campaigns across 3 decades of service, rising through the ranks by surviving battles that claimed entire companies. Yet now he remembered the orders he had received, the communications from high command that treated his soldiers as numbers on a ledger rather than human beings. He recalled the casual way General Sturn had ordered the 12th Company to hold Hill 247 on Cronus, knowing full well it was a death sentence designed to buy time for a more valuable Astartes strike force to achieve the real objective. The doctrine of Imperial Guard tactics relies upon overwhelming the enemy through sheer weight of numbers. This is not because such tactics are the most effective, but because they are the most economical in terms of resources deemed valuable by Imperial command. A regiment of 10,000 guardsmen costs less to equip and train than a single Space Marine. The loss of an entire division is considered acceptable if it preserves a squad of Astartes or a single Lehman Russ tank. The revelation struck the recruitment worlds with devastating force. On Vostroyan Prime, where entire families served together in the firstborn regiments, Commissar Alexei Danilov watched his lifetime of service crumble around him. He had spent 40 years maintaining discipline and morale among men and women who faced impossible odds with unflinching courage. He had condemned deserters and cowards, believing that such harsh measures preserved the lives of those who remained. Now he learned that the High Command had never intended for any of them to survive their deployments. The courage he had demanded from his soldiers had been wasted on missions designed to consume them. The average life expectancy of an Imperial Guardsman in active combat is 15 hours. This statistic is well known to regimental command staff, but is never shared with the enlisted personnel or their families. Recruitment propaganda speaks of glory and honor, of serving the God Emperor in his most sacred duty. The reality is that most guardsmen die in their first engagement, often without firing a shot, frequently without ever seeing the enemy that ends them. Magda Holst, still kneeling in the grain fields of Demeter Prime, where she had learned of her daughter's sacrifice to the Astronomicon, felt fresh horror wash over her as the broadcast continued. Her son Thomas had enlisted in the Demeter Rifles 5 years ago, his last letter home speaking of deployment to the eastern fringe to fight against Xenos raiders. She had not heard from him since, but the local administratum office had assured her that no news was good news, that the Emperor's armies were winning glorious victories against humanity's enemies. Now she began to understand why the communications had stopped. The tactical manuals distributed to guard commanders contain detailed calculations for acceptable loss ratios. Human wave assault doctrine states that casualties of 70% or higher are acceptable if the objective is achieved. Defensive formations are designed to maximize the time enemy forces spend ending guardsmen, thereby preserving more valuable assets for counterattack. The infamous last stand orders issued to surrounded units are not desperate attempts at heroic resistance, but deliberate sacrifices designed to tie up enemy resources. On Terra itself, in the halls of the Departmentum Munitorum, logistics coordinator Vex 9847 stared at the data slates that had been his life's work for 30 years. Every requisition form, every casualty report, every deployment order had been processed with bureaucratic efficiency, yet the numbers had always seemed disconnected from human reality, abstract figures representing logistical challenges rather than lives lost. Now the broadcast forced him to confront what those numbers had always meant. The regiment strength deployment to Armageddon that had been listed as total loss represented 8,000 individual deaths. The casualty replacement requests that crossed his desk daily were pleas for fresh bodies to feed into the same meat grinder that had consumed their predecessors. The communications between field commanders reveal the true nature of Imperial Guard operations. Acceptable losses for minimal territorial gain, reads one report from the Sabbat World's Crusade. Recommend continued frontal assault until enemy ammunition exhausted, states another from the Macarian campaigns. Guard units successfully drew enemy fire, enabling Astarte's flanking maneuver, summarizes a battle that killed 12,000 soldiers to save the lives of 50 space marines. The words reached the veterans who had somehow survived their service and returned to civilian life. On the industrial world of Krieg, where the population had been conditioned to accept death as the highest honor, former guardsman Klaus Brenner felt something approaching madness as he processed the revelation. He had lost his entire squad on Cadian Gate, watching his friends die around him as they held a meaningless trench against overwhelming odds. Their sergeant had told them they were buying time for reinforcements that never came. Now he learned that no reinforcements had ever been intended. Their deaths had served no strategic purpose beyond absorbing enemy fire that might otherwise have threatened more valuable assets. The recruitment slogans that adorn Imperial Guard propaganda posters bear no resemblance to military reality. Only in death does duty end is not an inspiring maxim about dedication, but a literal statement of operational doctrine. The Emperor protects refers not to divine intervention, but to the protection that Guard casualties provide to more important military assets. For the glory of the Imperium acknowledges that individual guardsmen will gain no glory themselves, but their deaths will contribute to the abstract concept of imperial glory. The broadcast reached the families of current serving guardsmen across the galaxy. On Talan, where the desert regiments had fought with legendary skill and courage, mothers who had sent their sons to war with pride began to demand answers from local recruitment officials. The Talan 3rd Mechanized had been deployed to the Damocles Crusade 18 months ago, their communications increasingly infrequent as the campaign progressed. Official reports spoke of tactical victories and successful Xenos elimination. Now the families began to suspect that their sons' silence had a more permanent explanation. The medical facilities attached to Imperial Guard formations are designed not to save lives, but to return wounded soldiers to combat as quickly as possible. Guardsmen who survive their injuries are not granted medical discharge, but are instead classified as walking wounded and returned to active duty. Pain suppressants and stimulants replace proper medical treatment. Prosthetic limbs are installed not to improve quality of life, but to maintain combat effectiveness. The concept of retirement due to wounds does not exist in Imperial Guard doctrine. Colonel Kellen remembered the field hospital on Cronus, where medics worked frantically to patch up soldiers just enough to return them to the fighting. Men with missing limbs were fitted with crude prosthetics and sent back to the trenches. Soldiers suffering from shell shock were dosed with combat stimulants and declared fit for duty. The few who objected were shot by commissars for cowardice. He had believed this was necessary pragmatism, the harsh reality of war in a universe where humanity's survival hung in the balance. Now he understood it was simply violence by another name. The decorations and honors awarded to Imperial Guard units serve not to recognize genuine heroism, but to maintain recruitment levels on home worlds. Medals are distributed according to casualty rates rather than tactical achievements. The higher the losses, the more commendations are awarded posthumously. This creates the illusion that death in service leads to recognition and honor, encouraging fresh recruits to seek the same fate. The revelation began to spark dangerous questions across Imperial space. If the Imperial Guard was designed to waste human life, what did that say about the enemies they fought? If victories could be achieved through other means, but commanders chose mass casualties instead, what was the true purpose of the Imperial military machine? The answers that suggested themselves were too terrible for most citizens to contemplate fully. The strategic doctrine of the Imperial Guard can be summarized in a single phrase: acceptable losses. Every operation begins with calculations of how many soldiers can be sacrificed to achieve the objective. These calculations never include attempts to minimize casualties, only determinations of whether sufficient reserves exist to replace the expected dead. The lives of guardsmen are factored into military planning exactly the same way ammunition expenditure is calculated. On distant worlds where guard regiments had been recruited decades ago, communities that had built their identity around military service began to confront uncomfortable truths. The monuments to fallen heroes took on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of deliberate waste. The annual celebrations of military victories became harder to justify when those victories had been purchased with unnecessary deaths. Most disturbing of all, the next generation of young people approaching recruitment age began to ask questions that had no acceptable answers. The Imperial Guard serves a function beyond military necessity. It acts as a mechanism for population control, removing excess young people from worlds where they might otherwise cause social instability. It provides an outlet for aggressive tendencies that might otherwise be directed against Imperial authority. Most importantly, it maintains the illusion that individual sacrifice for the Imperium has meaning, even as it ensures that such sacrifice achieves nothing of strategic value. The Veritas Vox paused in its revelations, allowing the galaxy to process the enormity of what it had learned. The Imperial Guard was not a military force in any traditional sense. It was an elaborate system for the disposal of human life, designed to consume the young and desperate while maintaining the fiction of noble service. Every family that had lost a son or daughter to the Guard had not lost them to the enemies of mankind, but to the deliberate indifference of their own commanders. Yet perhaps the most terrible aspect of this revelation was its logical necessity within the imperial system. If human life truly had no value beyond its utility to the state, then the casual disposal of millions of soldiers made perfect sense. The Guard was not failing in its mission, but fulfilling it exactly as designed. The waste was not a regrettable side effect, but the primary objective. The broadcast resumed, promising even darker truths to come. The galaxy had learned that their soldiers were expendable, their officers indifferent, and their military victories built upon mountains of unnecessary body. Yet this was only the beginning of the horror that imperial military doctrine represented. The Emperor's finest, it seemed, were finest only at dying in vast numbers for causes that meant nothing to those who ordered their deaths. The galaxy had barely begun to process the casual disposal of its military forces when the Veritas Vox prepared to reveal an atrocity so vast that it dwarfed all previous horrors. The device's next transmission would expose the ultimate expression of imperial justice, where entire worlds and all their inhabitants could be erased from existence on the whim of a single individual. The Inquisition possesses the authority to order exterminatus upon any world within the Imperium, the ancient voice declared, each word falling like the tolling of a death knell for civilizations. This power has been exercised 1,247 times in the past millennium alone, resulting in the deaths of approximately 3.2 trillion imperial citizens. These were not enemy worlds conquered in war, but loyal imperial planets whose populations died for the crime of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. On Terra, in the obsidian towers of the inquisitorial fortress, Lord Inquisitor Vex Machinator felt his augmetic hearts stutter as classified records that should have been buried beneath layers of psychic encryption and mind-locked data vaults spilled forth through the impossible transmission. The Ordo Malleus archives contained detailed reports of every exterminatus action, complete with casualty estimates, strategic assessments, and post-operation analysis. These documents had been sealed with blood oaths and death curses, accessible only to those with the highest clearance. Now they were being broadcast to every citizen in the galaxy. The reasoning employed by the Inquisition when ordering planetary destruction follows a simple calculus. It is better for 1 billion innocent souls to perish than for a single corrupted individual to escape and potentially contaminate other worlds. This doctrine treats Imperial citizens not as people to be protected, but as potential vectors for corruption that must be eliminated when containment becomes inconvenient. The broadcast began to list specific examples, each one striking the galaxy like a hammer blow. Typhon Primaris, destroyed in 801 M41 for harboring a suspected Genestealer cult. Population 4.7 billion. Subsequent investigation revealed no evidence of alien contamination. Verdana 3, subjected to viral bombing in 923 M41 after a single astropath reported disturbing visions. Population 2.3 billion. The visions were later determined to be side effects of standard psychic conditioning medications. Magda Holst, still standing in the grain fields of Demeter Prime, felt the universe tilt around her as one name on the list struck her like a physical blow. Harvest Moon, obliterated in 987. M41 following reports of chaos cult activity. Population 890 million. Her sister Lyra had moved to Harvest Moon 30 years ago with her husband and 3 children. The family had lost contact during what the Administratum had described as severe warp storm activity that made astropathic communication impossible. Magda had spent decades hoping for word that her sister's family had survived. Now she learned that there had been no warp storm, no natural disaster, no evacuation to safer worlds. The Inquisition had simply erased them all. The months of shame represent perhaps the most egregious example of inquisitorial excess in recent Imperial history, the Veritas Vox continued, its mechanical voice indifferent to the cosmic injustice it described. Following the First War for Armageddon, Inquisitor Lord Jack Draco ordered the sterilization and imprisonment of the entire surviving civilian population. 8 billion Imperial citizens who had successfully defended their world against demonic invasion were rewarded with forced sterilization, mind-wiping, and lifetime imprisonment in work camps scattered across the galaxy. The revelation struck Armageddon itself with particular force. Governor Herman Strab stood in his palace, surrounded by the rebuilt splendor of his capital city, while learning that the men and women who had made that rebuilding possible had been sentenced to a fate worse than death. The surviving population of Armageddon consisted entirely of people who had been born after the war or imported from other worlds. The original Armageddonians, the ones who had actually fought the demons and won, had been disappeared by their own government. The justification provided for this atrocity was that exposure to demonic forces, even successful resistance against them, represented an unacceptable contamination risk. Citizens who had proven their loyalty through blood and sacrifice were deemed more dangerous than the actual demons they had defeated. The sterilization ensured that their contaminated genetic material could not be passed to future generations, while the mind-wiping eliminated their memories of effective anti-daemon tactics that might have been useful in future conflicts. Tech Dominus Valek 77, still standing before the Veritas Vox on the dead forge world of Zerion Prime, felt his optical implants dim as the full scope of the revelation processed through his augmented consciousness. The Adeptus Mechanicus had provided the technology for the Armageddon sterilizations, following ancient protocols for genetic cleansing that dated back to the dark age of technology. He had always believed these procedures were used only on confirmed mutants and heretics. The idea that they had been deployed against loyal Imperial citizens solely for the crime of surviving a demon invasion was beyond his capacity to reconcile with any coherent moral framework. The work camps established for the Armageddon survivors were designed not for rehabilitation or monitoring, but for the gradual elimination of the imprisoned population through exhaustion, malnutrition, and despair. The average life expectancy in these facilities was 18 months. Guards were recruited from penal legions and explicitly instructed to view the prisoners as condemned heretics rather than loyal citizens. Sexual assault, torment, and casual violence were not only tolerated, but encouraged as methods of psychological control. The broadcast continued with a clinical recitation of horrors that reduced entire civilizations to statistical abstractions. Quintus Severus, virus-bombed for refusing to increase psychotithes by 300%. Population, 1.8 billion. New Canaan, subjected to cyclonic torpedo bombardment after a PDF regiment questioned orders to fire upon civilian protesters. Population, 675 million. Paradise World Epsilon 7, obliterated by orbital lance strikes when the planetary governor requested permission to reduce working hours in manufacturing centers. Population, 45 million. On distant worlds, families who had lost contact with relatives suddenly understood the true fate of those they had mourned as missing. The Administratum's standard explanation of warp storm interference or communications disruption had hidden genocides of unprecedented scale. Entire family lines had been erased not by alien invasion or chaos corruption, but by inquisitors who found it more convenient to destroy worlds than to investigate them properly. The decision-making process for Exterminatus requires the authorization of only a single inquisitor, the Veritas Vox explained with mechanical precision. No higher authority need be consulted, no evidence beyond personal suspicion is required, and no appeals process exists once the order is given. Individual inquisitors have been granted the power to commit genocide against imperial citizens based entirely on their personal paranoia or convenience. Lord Inquisitor Machinata remembered the protocols he had learned during his training centuries ago. The power to order Exterminatus was presented as the ultimate responsibility, a burden that only the most dedicated servants of the Emperor could bear. Yet the actual procedures were disturbingly simple. A single Vox transmission, authenticated by personal cipher codes, could trigger the annihilation of billions of human lives. There were no safeguards, no review processes, no mechanisms to prevent abuse. The system was designed to prioritize speed over accuracy, ensuring that inquisitors could act on their suspicions without delay or oversight. Case Study 7749-Gamma demonstrates the arbitrary nature of inquisitorial justice. Mordian Prime was scheduled for Exterminatus in 945 M41 after Inquisitor Helena Valeria detected suspicious levels of compliance among the population. The operation was cancelled only because the Inquisitor's transport was delayed by engine failure, giving her time to reconsider. A subsequent investigation revealed no evidence of corruption. The 20 billion citizens of Mordian Prime owe their lives to a mechanical malfunction, not to any evaluation of evidence or concern for justice. The revelation exposed the grotesque lottery that determined survival in the Imperium. Citizens could live virtuous lives, serve faithfully for generations, and die horribly because a single inquisitor experienced a moment of paranoid suspicion. The difference between continued existence and total annihilation often came down to factors as arbitrary as travel schedules, personal moods, or clerical errors in classified reports. The aftermath of Exterminatus operations includes systematic efforts to hide the truth from surviving Imperial citizens. The broadcast continued relentlessly. Astrocartographic records are altered to show destroyed worlds as lost to warp storms or contact disrupted. Family members seeking information about missing relatives are mind-wiped or eliminated to prevent the spread of accurate information. Entire subsectors are declared off-limits for centuries to prevent accidental discovery of debris fields. On the Forge world of Mars, Fabricator General Kelber Hall's successor reviewed the technical specifications for Exterminatus weaponry with new understanding. The cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, and atmospheric incinerators in the Mechanicus arsenals were not defensive weapons designed to protect humanity from alien threats. They were tools of oppression, created specifically to violence Imperial citizens when their continued existence became inconvenient for the Inquisition. Every blessing of the Omnissiah invoked during their construction had been a prayer over instruments of genocide. The psychological profiles of Inquisitors authorized to order Exterminatus reveal disturbing patterns of paranoia, megalomania, and sociopathic disregard for human life, the Veritas Vox declared, exposing secrets that the Ordo Malleus had buried beneath layers of psychic conditioning and mind locks. Many develop what their own records describe as extinction addiction, a compulsive need to destroy worlds that manifests as increasingly trivial justifications for planetary annihilation. Inquisitor Mordax Toth ordered 17 Exterminatus actions in a single decade, including one world whose only crime was producing artwork he found aesthetically disturbing. The galaxy began to understand that the Inquisition operated not as protectors of humanity, but as its greatest threat. The organization tasked with defending Imperial citizens from corruption had become a force of random, unpredictable annihilation that killed more loyal humans than all the enemies of mankind combined. Every citizen of every world lived under an implicit death sentence that could be carried out at any moment for any reason by individuals whose mental stability was demonstrably compromised. The true casualty count of inquisitorial actions exceeds the losses inflicted by every Orc War, Tyrannid Hive fleet, and Chaos Incursion combined, the broadcast revealed with mechanical precision. In the past millennium alone, the Inquisition has killed more Imperial citizens than have died in all other conflicts combined. The organization, established to protect humanity from its enemies, has become humanity's most effective enemy. Across the galaxy, populations began to look at their local inquisitorial installations with new eyes. The fortress cathedrals and hidden sanctuaries that had once represented protection and justice now appeared as monuments to genocide and madness. Citizens realized that every inquisitor walking among them possessed the power and legal authority to exterminate their entire world on a whim. The protectors were the predators, and there was no protection from the protectors. Current inquisitorial doctrine classifies any knowledge of Exterminatus operations as contamination, requiring immediate sterilization. The Veritas Vox continued, sealing the horror with the revelation that learning the truth was itself a capital offense. Citizens who discover evidence of unauthorized planetary destruction are considered corrupted by forbidden knowledge and are subject to summary condemned. The truth itself has been weaponized against the people it concerns most directly. The broadcast paused, allowing the galaxy to process the magnitude of what it had learned. The Imperium did not protect its citizens from extinction. It was the primary author of their extinction. 3 trillion humans had died, not to defend humanity, but to satisfy the paranoid delusions of individuals who had appointed themselves judge, jury, and executioner for entire worlds. Yet perhaps the most terrible aspect of this revelation was its logical consistency within the imperial system. If human life had no intrinsic value, if citizens existed only to serve the state, then their casual elimination for administrative convenience made perfect sense. The Inquisition was not failing in its duty, but performing it exactly as the system intended. The Veritas Vox resumed its transmission, preparing to reveal truths that would make even the horror of industrial genocide seem like a minor administrative detail. The galaxy had learned that its protectors were its destroyers, that justice was indistinguishable from madness, and that survival was nothing more than a temporary oversight in a system designed to consume human life on an unimaginable scale. The Emperor protects, the saying went. But from whom? And for how long? And at what cost to those he claimed to defend? These questions would soon have answers that no human mind was prepared to hear. The galaxy still reeled from learning that its protectors were genocidal madmen when the Veritas Vox prepared to shatter the final illusion that bound Imperial society together. This revelation would strike at the very concept that had given meaning to billions of lives across the stars, the idea that they were citizens of a great empire rather than mere livestock awaiting defeat. Imperial citizenship is a legal fiction designed to mask the reality of absolute slavery, the ancient voice declared, each word stripping away millennia of carefully constructed lies. Every human being within the Imperium's borders is classified not as a citizen with rights and protections, but as a resource belonging to the state. You possess no legal standing, no inherent value, and no protection from the arbitrary exercise of imperial authority. You are property, nothing more. On the hive world of Necromunda, in the administrative centers where millions of citizens queued daily to renew work permits and residence authorizations, Senior Clerk Mordian Hax felt his world collapse around him. He had spent 30 years processing citizenship documentation, believing he was maintaining the bureaucratic foundation that protected ordinary people from the chaos of an ungoverned universe. The forms he had filed, the permits he had issued, the identity cards he had validated, all had been elaborate theater, designed to maintain the illusion that imperial subjects had legal status beyond mere possession. The Lex Imperialis, the legal code that supposedly governs imperial society, contains no provisions for citizen rights. The broadcast continued with mechanical precision. The entire document is structured around the obligations, duties, and penalties imposed upon imperial subjects. Citizens may be relocated, conscripted, sterilized, lobotomized, or condemned without trial, appeal, or justification beyond administrative convenience. The concept of due process does not exist in imperial law, because imperial subjects are not legal persons, but state assets. The revelation struck the mid-hive levels with particular force, where generations of families had built their lives around the belief that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded with security and advancement. Merchant-class families who had accumulated modest wealth discovered that their property rights existed only at the sufferance of planetary governors. Professional guilds that had negotiated working conditions and wages learned that their contracts were worthless documents that could be voided without recourse. The comfortable middle strata of hive society realized that their position was not the result of earned privilege, but temporary administrative oversight. The tithe system operates not as taxation, but as institutionalized theft, the Veritas Vox explained, exposing the mechanisms that had sustained the Imperium for 10 millennia. Planetary governments possess no authority to negotiate tithe levels or contest imperial demands. The Administratum calculates resource extraction based upon maximum sustainable exploitation, deliberately maintaining populations at subsistence levels to prevent the accumulation of wealth or power that might challenge imperial authority. Magda Holst, standing in the grain fields of Demeter Prime, understood suddenly why her agricultural world produced vast quantities of food, yet its population remained perpetually on the edge of famine. The tithes demanded by the Imperium consumed not just surplus production, but the minimum necessary for local survival. The starvation that claimed thousands of citizens every year during poor harvests was not natural disaster, but deliberate policy designed to ensure that Demeter's population remained dependent upon imperial food distributions and could never achieve self-sufficiency. The hive cities that house the majority of imperial citizens were designed as concentration camps disguised as urban centers, the broadcast revealed, transforming every citizen's understanding of their living conditions. The vertical structure that forces billions into cramped vertical spaces serves not architectural necessity, but social control. The deliberate stratification that places the wealthy at the top and the poor at the bottom creates artificial scarcity and competition that prevents unified resistance to imperial exploitation. In the underhive of Necromunda, gang leader Grex, Iron Tooth Marcus, had always assumed that the squalor and violence of the lower levels resulted from natural urban decay and resource limitations. Now he understood that the underhive's hellish conditions were not the accidental byproduct of overpopulation, but the intended result of imperial policy. The toxic air, contaminated water, and structural decay that killed thousands monthly served the purpose of maintaining fear and desperation among the population, while providing a convenient disposal method for citizens deemed surplus to requirements. The nobility that rules imperial worlds maintains their position not through merit or democratic selection, but through deliberate impoverishment of the general population, the Veritas Vox continued, exposing the mechanisms that had concentrated wealth and power in the hands of the few. Noble houses are granted exclusive rights to resources, manufacturing, and trade, creating artificial monopolies that ensure permanent economic subjugation of the working classes. The wealth disparity between rulers and subjects is not natural inequality, but engineered dependency. Lord Governor Hax Vren of the hive world Mordian found himself staring at reports he had filed with the Administratum for decades, documents that detailed population management strategies and resource allocation models. The bureaucratic language had always obscured the reality of what these policies meant for individual citizens. Now he saw them clearly for what they were: instruction manuals for the systematic impoverishment of billions of human beings to maintain the power structure that kept his family in control. Recruitment into imperial military service, industrial labor, and administrative positions operates not as opportunity for advancement, but as human harvesting, the broadcast declared, transforming every citizen's understanding of their career prospects. The Administratum maintains detailed demographic models that calculate optimal population levels for each world, with excess population systematically removed through military conscription, labor transportation, and involuntary colonization programs. The revelation struck recruitment centers across the galaxy with devastating force. On Cadia, where military service had been the highest honor for countless generations, families began to understand that their sons and daughters had not volunteered for glorious service, but had been selected for removal from the breeding population. The pride they had felt in their children's acceptance into the Cadian shock troops transformed into horror as they realized that military recruitment served primarily as population control rather than defense. The concept of social mobility within imperial society is carefully maintained propaganda designed to prevent despair-driven rebellion, the Veritas Vox explained, destroying the dreams that had sustained billions of citizens through lives of grinding poverty. Occasional promotions from lower social strata serve not to reward merit, but to create the illusion that advancement is possible through loyalty and hard work. The promoted individuals become examples used to justify the continued oppression of those who remain in poverty. Tec Dominus Valak 77, still standing before the broadcasting device on the dead Forge world, processed the implications through his augmented consciousness. His own rise through the ranks of the Adeptus Mechanicus had seemed to validate the imperial promise that dedication to the Emperor's will would be rewarded with advancement and responsibility. Now he understood that his promotion had served not to recognize his abilities, but to create a visible symbol of possible advancement that would encourage continued submission from his former peers. The Administratum maintains classified reports on every imperial world that categorize citizens not as individuals, but as resource units, the broadcast continued, revealing the bureaucratic machinery that reduced human lives to statistical abstractions. Population reports classify citizens by labor output, reproductive potential, military utility, and disposal priority. These documents refer to human beings using the same terminology applied to manufactured goods and raw materials. On Terra itself, in the vast archives of the Adeptus Administratum, Senior Adept Vox Terminus had spent centuries processing the demographic reports that flowed from across the galaxy. The standardized forms that classified planetary populations had always struck him as efficient administrative tools designed to optimize resource allocation and maintain social stability. Now he recognized them as livestock management documents that treated human beings as breeding stock and expendable labor units. The legal protections that supposedly exist for imperial citizens contain systematic loopholes that render them meaningless in practice, the Veritas Vox revealed, exposing the hollow nature of imperial justice. The right to trial can be waived by any imperial authority for reasons of military necessity, social stability, or administrative efficiency. The right to property can be revoked through eminent domain, emergency requisition, or suspected heretical contamination. The right to life can be suspended for citizens classified as surplus population, security risks, or genetic undesirables. The revelation transformed every citizen's understanding of their place in the imperial hierarchy. The work permits that had seemed like protection revealed themselves as tracking devices that monitored population movement and labor assignment. The identification documents that had provided security became chains that bound citizens to their assigned roles and locations. The legal codes that had promised justice exposed themselves as instructions for the systematic oppression of the human species. Planetary governors maintain detailed casualty projections for their populations, calculating acceptable loss rates for various scenarios including famine, plague, industrial accidents, and social unrest, the broadcast declared, revealing the cold mathematics that determined who lived and who died across imperial space. These projections treat human death not as tragedy to be prevented, but as manageable statistical variation to be planned for and accommodated. Governor Hax Vren found himself reviewing his own casualty projections, documents that had seemed like prudent disaster preparedness, but now revealed themselves as violence by mathematics. The acceptable loss rates for different demographic categories spelled out in bureaucratic language which lives had value and which could be sacrificed without consequence. Children below working age, 15% acceptable annual mortality. Adults past prime reproductive years, 25% acceptable annual mortality. Citizens classified as social undesirables, 40% acceptable annual mortality. The entire concept of imperial citizenship exists solely to maintain the illusion of participation in a social contract that does not exist, the Veritas Vox concluded, delivering the final blow to 10 millennia of political mythology. Citizens are not partners in imperial society, but victims of it. They possess no rights that cannot be revoked, no protections that cannot be waived, and no value beyond their utility to the state apparatus. The difference between an imperial citizen and a slave is purely semantic. The broadcast paused, allowing the galaxy to process the magnitude of what it had learned. Every person who had ever taken pride in their imperial citizenship, every family that had trusted in imperial protection, every community that had believed in imperial justice, now understood that they had been deluding themselves. They were not citizens of a great empire, but prisoners in a galactic concentration camp, maintained in the illusion of freedom to prevent the despair that would come with recognizing their true status. Yet perhaps the most terrible aspect of this revelation was its logical consistency with everything else the Veritas Vox had revealed. If the Emperor was a tormented body, if psychers were industrial fuel, if servitors were lobotomized slaves, if soldiers were disposable ammunition, if entire worlds could be destroyed on a whim, then of course citizenship would be meaningless. In a system designed to consume human life on an industrial scale, legal rights and protections would only interfere with efficient resource exploitation. The galaxy had learned that it was not home to citizens but cattle. The only question remaining was whether the cattle would continue to accept their fate or finally recognize that they outnumbered their shepherds by billions to one. The Veritas Vox resumed its transmission, preparing to reveal the mechanisms by which this system of total oppression had been maintained and hidden from its victims for 10,000 years. The lies were being stripped away layer by layer, and each new truth made the previous horrors seem almost merciful by comparison. Freedom, it seemed, had been the cruelest lie of all. For how could the enslaved be free if they never knew they were enslaved? The answer to that question would reshape the galaxy forever. The galaxy still grappled with the revelation that citizenship was slavery when the Veritas Vox prepared to unveil the mechanisms by which such comprehensive deception had been maintained for 10 millennia. This truth would expose the systematic destruction of human knowledge and the deliberate cultivation of ignorance as tools of imperial control. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years conducting the most comprehensive campaign of intellectual genocide in human history, the ancient voice declared, each word cutting through the void like a blade through the fabric of accepted reality. The dark age of technology, which your ancestors remember as humanity's golden era, was not lost through accident or alien invasion. It was deliberately destroyed by imperial forces to prevent citizens from understanding what they had been denied. On the library world of Ophelia Quintus, Chief Librarian Matthias Caney stood frozen among the vast archives that had been his life's work for 60 years. The sanctified data vaults around him contained what the Imperium claimed were the most complete records of human history available anywhere in the galaxy. Yet now he began to understand that these archives were not repositories of knowledge, but monuments to its systematic destruction. Every text had been edited, every historical account sanitized, every technological manual stripped of its most crucial information. The standard template construct databases that could have provided every imperial world with technological marvels beyond imagination were not lost to warp storms or Xenos raiders. The broadcast continued with mechanical precision. They were located, catalogued, and systematically destroyed by the early Imperium to prevent populations from achieving technological independence. Citizens who possessed the ability to create advanced technologies without imperial oversight represented threats to central authority that had to be eliminated. The revelation struck the Forge worlds with particular devastation. On Mars, Fabricator General Ord 953 accessed restricted archives that he had never been authorized to review, following authentication codes that the Veritas Vox somehow provided. The documents revealed detailed inventories of Dark Age technological artifacts discovered during the Great Crusade, complete with imperial orders for their destruction. Plasma generators capable of powering entire hive cities without pollution. Medical devices that could cure diseases and extend human lifespan indefinitely. Transportation systems that could move populations between star systems without relying on warp travel. All of it had been found, catalogued, and deliberately destroyed. The historical records maintained by the Adeptus Administratum have been systematically altered to remove evidence of imperial failures and atrocities, the Veritas Vox revealed, exposing the machinery of historical revision that had rewritten the past. The Age of Apostasy has been edited to minimize the scope of ecclesiarchal corruption. The War of the Beast has been revised to hide the Imperium's near-total collapse. The Horus heresy itself has been sanitized to obscure the legitimate grievances that drove half the Primarchs to rebellion. Chief Archivist Valdez Prime of Terra's Hall of Records felt his augmetic hearts stutter as classified editorial directives scrolled across his data screens. Document after document showed the systematic revision of historical accounts, with entire chapters of human experience deleted or rewritten to support imperial propaganda. The directives came from the highest levels of imperial authority, signed by high lords and bearing the seal of the Inquisition itself. History was not recorded in the Imperium. It was manufactured to serve political necessity. The suppression of knowledge about chaos has created a population deliberately vulnerable to the very corruption the Imperium claims to prevent, the broadcast declared, revealing the catastrophic failure of ignorance-based protection. Citizens who encounter demonic activity without understanding its nature are more likely to fall to corruption than those with proper knowledge of chaos tactics and psychology. The policy of hiding chaotic threats has resulted in millions of unnecessary casualties and corruptions that could have been prevented through education. Tech Dominus Valek 77, still maintaining his vigil before the broadcasting device on Xerion Prime, processed the implications through his augmented consciousness. The Omnissiah's teachings included extensive warnings about the dangers of forbidden knowledge, yet now he understood that these prohibitions had been crafted not to protect human souls, but to maintain imperial control. The citizens who had fallen to chaos corruption during the recent Black Crusades might have resisted if they had been taught to recognize the signs of demonic influence instead of being kept in ignorance of its very existence. The book burnings that occur regularly across imperial worlds are not spontaneous expressions of religious fervor, but coordinated campaigns directed by the Adeptus Ministorum, the Veritas Vox continued, exposing the industrial scale of intellectual destruction. Literary works, scientific treatises, philosophical texts, and historical chronicles are identified by roving censorship teams and marked for destruction. The criteria for condemnation include any content that might encourage independent thinking, challenge imperial authority, or suggest alternatives to current social organization. On the Scholam world of Byzantis Theta, where the children of the wealthy received the closest thing to comprehensive education available in the Imperium, Headmaster Augustus Vaughan reviewed his library's acquisitions records with growing horror. Every book, every data slate, every educational program had been approved by Ministorum censors before being allowed into the Scholam. The approval process removed not just obviously heretical content, but any material that might teach students to question authority or think independently. History lessons that mentioned pre-imperial human governments, scientific texts that suggested technological alternatives to imperial standards, literature that portrayed individual rebellion against unjust authority in positive terms, All of it had been systematically eliminated from imperial education. The truth about pre-imperial human civilizations has been hidden to prevent citizens from understanding that alternative forms of government are possible, the broadcast revealed, striking at one of the foundation myths of imperial society. Humanity did not require the emperor's guidance to achieve greatness. The dark age of technology represented the pinnacle of human achievement precisely because it was accomplished without centralized imperial control. The knowledge that humans once governed themselves through democratic federations, constitutional republics, and cooperative councils has been systematically suppressed because it proves that imperial authoritarianism is not necessary for human survival. The revelation reached scholars across the galaxy, individuals who had spent their lives studying the fragments of human history that imperial censors had allowed to survive. On the research station orbiting Ultramar, historiator Maximus Cato had dedicated 4 decades to reconstructing the timeline of human expansion across the galaxy. His work had always been hampered by gaps in the historical record, periods where entire centuries seemed to have been erased from official chronicles. Now he understood that these gaps were not accidental losses, but deliberate excisions designed to hide evidence of successful, non-imperial human societies. Scholars and historians who discover evidence of forbidden knowledge are subject to immediate termination by inquisitorial death squads, the Veritas Vox declared, revealing the fate that awaited intellectual curiosity. The Ordo Hereticus maintains specialized teams whose sole function is to eliminate researchers who approach dangerous truths. Academic institutions across the Imperium operate under constant surveillance, with faculty members reporting suspicious research interests to ecclesiarchal authorities who determine whether investigation should be allowed to continue. Professor Lysipa Kane of the University of Macraga had always wondered why certain research topics were classified as forbidden by university administration. Investigations into pre-imperial technology were discouraged through budget restrictions and career penalties. Studies of comparative government systems were simply not permitted. Any historical research that might reveal the true scope of imperial atrocities was redirected toward approved topics through academic pressure and professional sanctions. Now she understood that her colleagues who had pursued forbidden research and subsequently disappeared had not been relocated to other institutions, but eliminated by the very authority they had sought to study. The Imperium maintains a deliberate policy of educational limitation designed to produce citizens capable of performing assigned labor, but incapable of independent analysis, the broadcast continued, exposing the machinery of intellectual suppression. Literacy rates are carefully controlled to ensure that populations can read work instructions and religious texts, but cannot access complex political or technical literature. Mathematical education is limited to arithmetic necessary for industrial labor, preventing citizens from understanding statistical analysis that might reveal the scope of imperial exploitation. The revelation transformed every citizen's understanding of their educational experience. The basic literacy that seemed like imperial benevolence revealed itself as minimal skill provision designed to create useful but controllable workers. The technical training that appeared to offer advancement opportunities was actually intellectual limitation disguised as education. The religious instruction that dominated imperial schooling served not to provide moral guidance, but to instill unquestioning obedience to authority. Library worlds throughout the Imperium function not as centers of learning, but as censorship facilities, the Veritas Vox declared, revealing the true nature of institutions that citizens had believed preserved human knowledge. The vast archives maintained on these worlds contain primarily sanitized versions of approved texts, with original sources destroyed after editing. Librarians are not scholars, but censors, trained to identify and eliminate content deemed dangerous by imperial authorities. Chief Librarian Caney felt his world dissolve around him as he processed this revelation. The ancient texts he had believed himself to be preserving had been edited versions designed to maintain imperial myths while destroying actual historical truth. The rare manuscripts he had dedicated his life to protecting were forgeries created to replace authentic documents that had been systematically destroyed. His career had been spent not as a guardian of knowledge, but as an unwitting agent of ignorance. The fear of an educated populace permeates every level of imperial government, the broadcast revealed, exposing the paranoia that drove systematic intellectual suppression. Internal documents from the High Lords of Terra explicitly state that citizen education, beyond basic functional literacy, represents an existential threat to imperial authority. Populations capable of understanding complex political and economic concepts would inevitably recognize the exploitation and injustice that sustains imperial society. The revelation reached the upper levels of imperial government, where administrators who had implemented these policies suddenly saw their work in a new light. On Terra, in the halls of the Adeptus Administratum, Senior Adept Marcus Valdane reviewed education policy directives he had processed for decades. The documents spoke of social stability and security concerns. But now he understood they were instructions for the systematic cultivation of ignorance among imperial populations. Every restriction on citizen education had been designed not to protect society, but to prevent citizens from developing the intellectual tools necessary to recognize their oppression. The systematic destruction of scientific knowledge has left humanity technologically stagnant for 10 millennia, the Veritas Vox continued, revealing the price of ignorance-based control. Technologies that could have eliminated poverty, disease, and scarcity have been suppressed to maintain artificial dependencies that keep populations under imperial control. The suffering of billions could have been alleviated through knowledge that was deliberately destroyed to preserve the power structure that benefits from that suffering. Across the galaxy, citizens began to understand that their poverty, their ignorance, their vulnerability to disease and disaster were not natural conditions, but artificial impositions created by deliberate policy. The technological stagnation that left them dependent on imperial supply chains was not the result of lost knowledge, but destroyed knowledge. The intellectual limitations that prevented them from understanding alternatives to their current society were not natural human failings, but cultivated ignorance designed to maintain their enslavement. The Imperium's greatest achievement is not the conquest of space or the unification of humanity, the broadcast concluded, delivering the final blow to 10 millennia of imperial mythology. It is the creation of a system so comprehensive in its intellectual oppression that its victims actively participate in maintaining their own ignorance. Citizens have been taught to fear knowledge, to distrust independent thinking, and to celebrate the destruction of their own intellectual heritage. The Veritas Vox paused, allowing the galaxy to process the magnitude of what it had learned. The Imperium had not preserved human civilization, it had nearly destroyed it. The knowledge that could have made every world a paradise had been systematically eliminated to maintain the authority of those who benefited from universal suffering. The citizens who had believed themselves protected by imperial wisdom now understood that they had been deliberately kept ignorant to prevent them from recognizing the scope of their exploitation. Yet perhaps the most terrible aspect of this revelation was its effectiveness. 10,000 years of systematic intellectual suppression had created populations so thoroughly conditioned to ignorance that they would struggle to use knowledge, even if it were freely available. The Imperium had not just destroyed human knowledge, it had destroyed humanity's capacity to benefit from knowledge. The greatest prison was the one built inside the mind, and the Imperium had built that prison so thoroughly that its victims had forgotten they were imprisoned at all. The broadcast resumed, preparing to reveal truths that would make even the horror of systematic ignorance seem merciful by comparison. Knowledge, it seemed, was not the only thing the Imperium had destroyed in its quest for absolute control. The galaxy still reeled from learning that its ignorance was cultivated by design when the Veritas Vox prepared to deliver perhaps its most devastating revelation yet. This truth would expose the ultimate hypocrisy of the imperial system, that the very corruption it claimed to fight had already consumed the institutions sworn to oppose it. The chaos corruption that the Imperium claims to guard against has penetrated every level of imperial government, the ancient voice declared, each word striking like lightning through the fabric of institutional trust. The enemy is not at the gates. The enemy sits in the throne rooms, commands the fleets, and wears the very uniforms sworn to oppose it. The war against chaos was lost millennia ago, not through military defeat, but through systemic infiltration that the Imperium's leadership actively conceals. On Terra, in the Senatorum Imperialis, where the High Lords maintained their eternal vigil over humanity's fate, Lord Commander Militant Ecclesiarch Diasis VII felt his world crumble as classified intelligence reports began scrolling across screens that should have been impossible to access. The documents detailed chaos cult activity within the highest levels of imperial government, complete with names, dates, and evidence of corruption that reached into the very heart of the Imperium's power structure. Noble House Draconis of Segmentum Solar has practiced Slaaneshi rituals for over 3,000 years. The broadcast continued with mechanical precision, naming names and exposing secrets that had been buried beneath layers of aristocratic privilege and inquisitorial cover-ups. House Mordant of the Gothic sector maintains private shrines to Nurgle in the crypts beneath their ancestral palace. House Corvanus of Ultima Segmentum has produced 17 generations of secret Khorne cultists, including the current planetary governor of Macragga's crown. The revelation struck the imperial nobility with the force of a cyclonic torpedo. Across the galaxy, aristocratic families who had built their power on claims of ancient loyalty and pure bloodlines discovered that their peers had been worshipping the very entities the Imperium existed to oppose. The carefully maintained facade of noble purity collapsed as the Veritas Vox systematically exposed the chaos corruption that had been hidden behind titles and ceremonial honors for millennia. The Space Marine chapter known as the Crimson Sabres was declared lost in the warp in 823 M41, the broadcast revealed, exposing military cover-ups that struck at the heart of the Imperium's mythology. In truth, the entire chapter had fallen to Khorne worship and was exterminated by loyalist forces after they sacrificed the population of 3 imperial worlds to their blood god. The official records were falsified to prevent damage to Space Marine recruitment and morale across the Imperium. Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels stood in his sanctum aboard the battle barge Red Terre as the transmission revealed the fates of chapters that had supposedly vanished into the warp or been lost to alien predation. The Angels Vermilion, declared destroyed by Tyrannid Hive Fleet Kraken, had actually been corrupted by a Keeper of Secrets and eliminated by Grey Knight strike forces. The Steel Cobras, officially lost during the Badab War, had embraced Tzeentch and been atomized by their own battle brothers when their corruption was discovered. Chapter after chapter, the heroic disappearances that had inspired legends and recruitment propaganda revealed themselves as cover-ups for the most shameful failures imaginable. The Alpha Legion's infiltration of Imperial High Command has been ongoing for 10 millennia, the Veritas Vox declared, revealing the scope of strategic corruption that made every Imperial victory suspect. Alpha Legion operatives currently hold positions within the Adeptus Administratum, the Imperial Navy, the Astra Militarum Officer Corps, and the Inquisition itself. Key military campaigns have been compromised from their inception, with supposed Imperial victories serving Alpha Legion objectives that remain hidden even from the participating forces. Admiral Spire of Battlefleet Gothic felt his command authority evaporate as he processed the implications. The Macarian Crusade, the Sabbat Worlds campaign, the Damocles Gulf Crusade, all had been influenced or directed by Alpha Legion infiltrators operating within the Imperial command structure. Strategic decisions that had seemed like brilliant Imperial tactics revealed themselves as subtle manipulation designed to serve Chaos objectives while maintaining the illusion of Imperial success. The Inquisition's own members have fallen to Chaos corruption at rates far exceeding the general population, the broadcast continued, destroying the myth of inquisitorial incorruptibility. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex of the Ordo Malleus has been a secret servant of Tzeentch for over 2 centuries. Inquisitor Helena Valeria of the Ordo Hereticus practices Slaaneshi blood rituals in the basement of her orbital fortress. The very individuals tasked with identifying and eliminating Chaos corruption have become its most effective agents. Tech Dominus Valek 77, maintaining his vigil before the broadcasting device on Xerion Prime, felt his logic circuit strain as he processed the systematic nature of the revealed corruption. The Adeptus Mechanicus had always maintained that their augmetic implants and binary logic provided protection against Chaos influence, yet the broadcast was revealing that Forge Masters, Tech Priests, and even Fabricator Generals had fallen to corruption while maintaining their positions and authority. The very rationality that supposedly protected them had been turned into a tool of deception. Chaos-tainted artifacts are routinely used by Imperial officials who remain unaware of their corruption, the Veritas Vox revealed, exposing the subtle perversion of Imperial symbols and tools of authority. The ceremonial sword carried by Governor Val of Cadia is a demon weapon that has been feeding on his life force for 30 years. The Aquila pendant worn by Cardinal Vex of Ophelia VII contains a fragment of a demon's essence that influences his religious pronouncements. The command throne of Admiral Quarren's flagship incorporates materials taken from a Chaos shrine, slowly corrupting every order issued from its seat. The revelation transformed every Imperial citizen's understanding of their leaders and symbols. The governors who ruled their worlds, the admirals who commanded their fleets, the cardinals who guided their spiritual development, all were potentially compromised by corruption they might not even recognize. Every Imperial ceremony, every religious service, every official proclamation might be tainted by Chaos influence operating through corrupted artifacts and personnel. The Red Corsairs recruit not just from renegade Imperial forces, but from supposedly loyal regiments and naval crews, the broadcast declared, revealing recruitment networks that operated within the heart of Imperial military structure. Imperial Guard officers are approached with offers of power and advancement through Chaos worship. Naval personnel serving on ships that patrol the Maelstrom are systematically converted to serve Huron Blackheart while maintaining their official positions. Entire PDF regiments on worlds bordering Chaos-controlled space serve dual loyalties, appearing loyal to Imperial authority while secretly preparing for eventual defection. Colonel Marcus Kellan of the Valhallan 597th Ice Warriors, who had already learned that his soldiers were considered expendable ammunition, now faced the possibility that some of his fellow officers might be active chaos cultists. The brotherhood he had relied upon, the chain of command that had given his service meaning, might be compromised by individuals who served powers that sought the destruction of everything he had fought to protect. Planetary governors across the Imperium maintained secret pacts with chaos entities to preserve their positions of power, the Veritas Vox continued, exposing the political corruption that made imperial rule indistinguishable from chaos collaboration. Governor Maxime Fall of Cardia has been receiving strategic intelligence from a demon of Tzeentch for the past decade. Governor Herman Straub of Armageddon maintains his authority through a bargain with Khorne that requires monthly sacrifices of political dissidents, the very individuals trusted to defend imperial worlds from chaos corruption are its willing servants. The revelation reached deep into the personal lives of citizens who had trusted their planetary governments to protect them from the darkness beyond the stars. The governors they had supported, the policies they had endorsed, the security they had believed in, all might be nothing more than elaborate deceptions created by servants of the very powers that sought their destruction. The phenomenon known as the Black Rage that affects the Blood Angels and their successor chapters is not a genetic flaw, but a form of chaos corruption that has been deliberately concealed, the broadcast revealed, striking at one of the Imperium's most honored chapters. The condition is caused by exposure to a Khorne-tainted relic recovered during the Horus heresy. The Blood Angels' leadership has known this for millennia, but has chosen to hide the truth rather than lose their status as loyalist Astartes. Chapter Master Dante felt his twin hearts stop as the accusation struck him like a physical blow. The black rage that had claimed so many of his battle brothers, the curse that had defined his chapter's identity for 10,000 years, revealed as deliberate corruption that his predecessors had chosen to conceal rather than address. Every Death Company Marine who had fallen to the rage had been a victim not of genetic fate, but of chaos taint that the chapter's leadership had perpetuated through willful ignorance. The Astronomicon itself has been corrupted by chaos influence operating through compromised psychers in the choir, the Veritas Vox declared, revealing that even humanity's most sacred beacon had been tainted. Tzeentch cultists among the psyker tithes have slowly introduced chaotic resonances into the great working that guides imperial navigation. The light that ships follow through the warp now carries subtle corruption designed to influence the crews of vessels that rely upon it for guidance. The revelation meant that every ship that had used the Astronomicon for navigation, every crew that had trusted in the Emperor's light to guide them through the warp, had been exposed to chaos corruption. The very beacon that symbolized imperial unity and the Emperor's protection had become a vector for the spiritual contamination of the imperial navy and merchant fleets. The corruption within imperial institutions has reached such levels that loyalist and chaos forces are often indistinguishable, the broadcast continued, delivering the final blow to imperial military mythology. Battles between imperial and chaos forces frequently involve corrupted units on both sides, with the conflict serving chaos objectives regardless of the tactical outcome. The enemy has achieved victory not through conquest, but through the corruption of the concept of loyalty itself. The galaxy began to understand that the eternal war between order and chaos had been decided long ago, not through military defeat, but through the systematic corruption of the institutions that claimed to represent order. The Imperium had not protected humanity from chaos. It had become chaos wearing the mask of righteous authority. Every imperial victory might serve chaos objectives, every act of loyalty might advance Chaos goals. The war had been lost because the enemy had won by making victory indistinguishable from defeat. The greatest achievement of the Chaos gods is not the corruption of individual souls, but the corruption of the concept of incorruption itself, the Veritas Vox concluded, delivering a revelation that struck at the foundation of moral certainty. Citizens who believe themselves to be serving the Emperor may actually be serving chaos. Officials who think they are fighting corruption may be spreading it. The very act of seeking purity within imperial institutions may be the most effective form of corruption possible. The broadcast paused, allowing the galaxy to process the complete moral inversion that had been revealed. There were no clean hands in the Imperium, no pure institutions, no untainted authorities. The corruption that citizens had been taught to fear and resist had already won by making resistance indistinguishable from collaboration. The enemy was not coming. The enemy had already arrived and made itself indistinguishable from the defender. Yet perhaps the most terrible aspect of this revelation was its logical inevitability. In a system built upon lies, maintained through oppression, and sustained by the torment of its own god, how could anything remain pure? The Imperium's moral corruption had created the conditions for spiritual corruption, and now the two were so intertwined that they could no longer be separated. The Veritas Vox resumed its transmission, preparing to reveal truths that would make even the complete moral collapse of imperial authority seem like a minor administrative detail. The galaxy had learned that its protectors served the enemy, that its institutions had been captured, and that the war for humanity's soul had been lost before most citizens knew it was being fought. The only question remaining was whether there was anyone left who had not been corrupted, and whether such a person could survive the revelation of what the Imperium had truly become. The answer would reshape the galaxy forever. The galaxy still struggled to comprehend that corruption had captured its every institution when the Veritas Vox prepared to deliver the blow that would shatter the final refuge of human hope. This revelation would strip away the last illusion that had sustained billions through the darkness, exposing the spiritual foundation of the Imperium as the most elaborate fraud ever perpetrated upon humanity. The ecclesiarchy, which claims to be the guardian of humanity's soul, is the most corrupt institution in the Imperium, the ancient voice declared, each word falling like a cathedral bell, tolling for the death of faith itself. The cardinals who preach sacrifice live in luxury that would shame the nobles of the dark age of technology. The priests who demand poverty from their flocks accumulate wealth beyond measure. The very individuals trusted to guide humanity's spiritual development have turned religion into the ultimate instrument of exploitation. On the shrine world of Ophelia 7, Cardinal Vex stood in his private chambers, surrounded by art treasures and precious artifacts worth more than entire planetary economies. The golden chalices from which he drank sanctified wine cost more than the annual food budget for his cathedral's surrounding slums. The silk vestments that draped his corpulent frame were woven with threads more valuable than the lives of the faithful who starved outside his palace walls. For decades he had justified this wealth as necessary for the proper veneration of the God Emperor. Now he began to understand that it was simply theft sanctified by religious authority. Living saints, those miraculous figures that inspire faith across the galaxy, are not divine manifestations, but warp entities masquerading as holy beings, the Veritas Vox continued, striking at the heart of imperial spirituality. Saint Celestine herself is a greater demon of the warp, bound by ancient rituals to maintain the illusion of imperial divinity. The miracles attributed to saints are demonic powers exercised in service to goals that have nothing to do with human salvation. The revelation struck the faithful like a plague of understanding that spread faster than any disease. Sister Superior Seraphina of the Order of the Fierce Rose had dedicated her life to following St. Celestine's example, believing that her sacrifices and battles served the Emperor's will. The visions she had experienced during meditation, the supernatural strength that had carried her through impossible battles, the divine inspiration that had guided her tactical decisions, all revealed themselves as demonic influence operating through corrupted religious symbols. The wealth accumulated by the ecclesiarchy could feed every starving citizen in the Imperium for centuries, the broadcast declared, exposing the mathematical obscenity of religious inequality. Cathedral ships maintain treasuries that exceed the gross domestic product of entire sectors. Cardinal palaces consume resources that could support millions of families. The tithes collected in the Emperor's name are not used for humanitarian purposes, but to fund lifestyles of decadence that would shock even the most debauched noble houses. Tech Dominus Valak 77, still maintaining his vigil before the broadcasting device on Xerion Prime, processed the economic data streaming through the transmission with growing horror. His augmetic consciousness calculated the wealth redistribution statistics with mechanical precision. The ecclesiarchy's accumulated resources, if distributed among the imperial population, could eliminate poverty, hunger, and disease across entire subsectors. Instead, these resources funded private armies, personal luxuries, and architectural monuments to religious vanity. The miracles that maintain faith among the population are elaborate theatre productions staged by the ecclesiarchy, using advanced technology disguised as divine intervention, the Veritas Vox revealed, exposing the machinery of false hope. Holographic projectors create the appearance of divine visitations. Psychic conditioning makes witnesses believe they have experienced miraculous healing. Carefully orchestrated coincidences are presented as divine providence. The faithful are not experiencing genuine spiritual phenomena, but elaborate deceptions designed to maintain religious compliance. On the pilgrimage world of Savlar, where millions of citizens had traveled across the galaxy to witness the annual miracle of the Golden Light, Pilgrim Master Hadricus reviewed the technical specifications hidden in the cathedral's deepest vaults. The golden radiance that appeared above the shrine each year, inspiring renewed faith in thousands of witnesses, was generated by archaeotech projectors concealed within the cathedral's spires. The healing waters that cured diseases and disabilities contained pharmaceutical compounds that produced temporary improvements in symptoms while doing nothing to address underlying conditions. Every miracle was a lie, every divine intervention a carefully planned deception. The persecution of heretics serves not to protect imperial citizens from corruption, but to eliminate individuals who question ecclesiarchal authority, the broadcast continued, transforming martyrdom into violence and faith into fascism. The vast majority of citizens burned as heretics were guilty only of asking questions about religious doctrine or suggesting alternatives to current church policies. The Inquisition's purges serve the ecclesiarchy's political interests rather than humanity's spiritual welfare. Cardinal Vex remembered the heretic burnings he had overseen throughout his career, the hundreds of men and women who had been condemned to death for crimes against faith. The charges had seemed reasonable at the time, questioning the divinity of the Emperor, suggesting that local church policies caused unnecessary suffering, proposing theological interpretations that differed from orthodox doctrine. Now he understood that these individuals had been ended not for threatening humanity's spiritual welfare, but for threatening the ecclesiarchy's political control. The age of apostasy during which the ecclesiarchy nearly destroyed the Imperium through its excesses, has been systematically deleted from official religious history, the Veritas Vox declared, exposing the cover-up of institutional failure. Sebastian Thor's revolution, which saved the Imperium from ecclesiarchal tyranny, is mentioned only in passing in current religious texts. The true scope of Vandira's atrocities, the millions who died under ecclesiarchal rule, the near collapse of imperial civilization under religious authoritarianism, all have been hidden to prevent citizens from understanding the dangers of unchecked religious power. The revelation reached religious scholars across the galaxy, individuals who had spent their lives studying sanitized versions of imperial history that concealed the Church's greatest failures. On the cardinal world of Hydra 4, lexicographer Mordius had dedicated 40 years to chronicling the glorious history of the ecclesiarchy, following official sources that portrayed religious authority as humanity's salvation. Now he began to access archived documents that revealed the systematic violence, oppression, and mismanagement that had characterized religious rule throughout imperial history. The decree passive, which supposedly prohibits the ecclesiarchy from maintaining armed forces, is routinely violated through legal fictions and technicalities, the broadcast revealed, exposing the militarization of religious authority. The orders militant are classified as lay organizations rather than ecclesiarchal forces, despite being directly controlled by cardinal-level authority. The Frateris militia operates as a private army for religious officials, while maintaining the fiction of being independent volunteer organizations. Sister Seraphina processed the implications as she looked around her convent fortress, understanding suddenly that her order existed not to serve the Emperor's will, but to provide military force for the ecclesiarchy's political objectives. Every battle she had fought, every enemy she had killed, every sacrifice she had made in the name of faith had served the interests of corrupt religious officials rather than divine purpose. The doctrine of emperor worship itself contradicts the emperor's explicitly stated beliefs during his active lifetime, the Veritas Vox continued, revealing the fundamental theological fraud that underpinned imperial religion. The being you worship as a god explicitly rejected divinity and condemned religious worship as superstition that weakened human potential. The imperial cult exists in direct opposition to the emperor's documented teachings and philosophical positions. The revelation struck at the foundation of imperial spirituality with devastating force. Every prayer offered to the god emperor, every act of religious devotion, every moment of faith-based comfort had been offered to a being who would have condemned such worship as exactly the kind of primitive thinking he had sought to eliminate from human civilization. The relics venerated in imperial shrines are fraudulent artifacts manufactured to provide focal points for religious manipulation, the broadcast declared, destroying the sacred symbols that had sustained faith for millennia. The bones of saints are animal remains treated with chemical preservatives to create the appearance of supernatural preservation. The weapons of holy champions are standard imperial equipment modified with decorative elements to suggest divine origin. The miraculous artifacts that form the centerpieces of religious ceremonies are mass-produced forgeries created in ecclesiarchal workshops. On shrine worlds across the galaxy, pilgrims who had traveled for years to venerate holy relics discovered that their objects of worship were nothing more than elaborate counterfeits. The fingerbone of Saint Sabbat, which had inspired faith in millions of believers, was actually the treated remains of a common farm animal. The blessed sword of Saint Macarius was a standard power weapon, modified with gold plating and decorative inscriptions. Every sacred object was a lie. every holy relic a fraud designed to extract tithes and maintain religious control. The theological justifications for imperial suffering are deliberately crafted to prevent citizens from seeking practical solutions to preventable problems, the Veritas Vox revealed, exposing religion as a tool of political control rather than spiritual guidance. Poverty is portrayed as spiritually purifying rather than economically imposed. Disease is described as divine testing rather than the result of inadequate medical resources. Social inequality is presented as the emperor's plan rather than the result of deliberate policy decisions. The revelation transformed every sermon, every religious text, every moment of spiritual instruction into political propaganda designed to maintain acceptance of artificial suffering. Citizens who had found comfort in religious explanations for their hardships discovered that their faith had been weaponized against them, turned into a tool that prevented them from recognizing the human causes of their misery. The ecclesiarchy's greatest achievement is not the preservation of human faith, but its systematic corruption, the broadcast concluded, delivering the final blow to 10 millennia of religious authority. Citizens who believe they are serving the emperor through religious devotion are actually serving the political and economic interests of corrupt officials who have transformed spirituality into the ultimate confidence game. Cardinal Vex sank to his knees in his opulent chambers as the weight of his life's work revealed itself as elaborate fraud. Every sermon he had delivered, every blessing he had pronounced, every act of religious authority he had exercised, had served not to bring citizens closer to divine truth, but to maintain a system of exploitation that kept them spiritually enslaved while enriching their supposed spiritual guides. The broadcast paused, allowing the galaxy to process the complete collapse of religious meaning that had been revealed. Faith had not been humanity's salvation, but its most effective chain. Religion had not preserved human dignity, but systematically destroyed it. The spiritual authorities, trusted to guide humanity toward enlightenment, had led them deeper into ignorance and exploitation than any alien conqueror could have achieved. Yet perhaps the most terrible aspect of this revelation was its logical consistency with everything else the Veritas Vox had exposed. In a system built upon lies, sustained by oppression, and dedicated to the torment of its own God, how could religion be anything but another instrument of control? The ecclesiarchy had not failed to serve the emperor's will. It had succeeded perfectly in serving the interests of those who benefited from the emperor's suffering. The Veritas Vox resumed its transmission, preparing to reveal the immediate consequences of these revelations as they spread across the galaxy. Faith had died, authority had collapsed, and hope had been revealed as the cruelest deception of all. The galaxy would never be the same. The only question was whether anything would be left standing when the truth had finished its work. The price of faith, it seemed, had always been the surrender of reason. And now that the bill had come due, the cost was everything humanity had believed about itself. The Veritas Vox fell silent for the first time since its activation, its ancient mechanisms finally exhausted by the weight of truths it had broadcast across the galaxy. Yet the silence that followed was not peace, but the terrible quiet that precedes a storm of unimaginable proportions. Across 1,000,000 worlds, billions of human beings processed the complete destruction of everything they had believed about their universe, their society, and themselves. The reaction began not with organized rebellion, but with individual madness multiplied beyond counting. On Terra itself, in the shadow of the Imperial Palace, where the tormented emperor screamed in eternal agony, citizens poured from their hab blocks like water from a broken dam. The revelation that their god suffered unending torment while their prayers only reminded him of his pain drove entire populations into frenzies of grief and rage that defied description. High Lord Militant Ecclesiarch Deasis VII watched from his palace spire as the cathedral squares filled with howling masses of humanity. Citizens who had prostrated themselves in worship hours before now tore at the aquila symbols on their clothing, ripped blessed icons from shrine walls, and screamed accusations at the sky. The faithful had become faithless in the space of a single broadcast, their devotion transformed into fury that burned hotter than plasma fire. On the hive world of Necromunda, the revelation struck the teeming billions like a virus of understanding that spread through every level of the colossal urban structures. In the upper spires, nobles who had justified their wealth through claims of divine favor found their palaces besieged by citizens who now understood that nobility was simply institutionalized theft. Lord Gerontius Helmar's ancestral throne room became a battleground as his own household guards turned their weapons upon the aristocrats they had sworn to protect. The Underhive, that realm of perpetual darkness, where gang leader Grex, Iron Tooth, Marcus, had recognized his sister among the servitor workforce, erupted in violence that made its usual brutality seem merciful by comparison. Gangs that had fought each other for generations united in their rage against the tech priests and administrators who had created their mechanical siblings. Servitor maintenance facilities became charnel houses as populations sought to free the trapped consciousnesses within lobotomized bodies, often ending the very beings they sought to save. The Space Marine chapters faced a crisis that threatened their very existence as transhuman warriors found themselves torn between loyalty to an institution they now knew to be corrupt and oath bonds that had defined their purpose for centuries. Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels stood in his sanctum aboard the Red Tear, surrounded by battle brothers whose faces reflected the same terrible understanding that burned in his ancient features. "Brothers," he spoke into the gathering storm, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years of service. "We swore oaths to the Emperor, not to the Imperium that torments him. If these revelations are true, then our highest loyalty demands that we act not as servants of his suffering, but as instruments of his liberation." Yet even as some chapters chose the painful path of truth, others retreated into denial that bordered on madness. The Imperial Fist's fortress monastery on Terra became a sealed tomb, as Captain Lysander ordered the complete isolation of his battle brothers from the outside universe. If the truth was too terrible to bear, then truth itself must be rejected. Better to live in ignorance than die in knowledge that made existence unbearable. On the shrine world of Ophelia VII, where Cardinal Vex had maintained his palace of stolen wealth while citizens starved, the collapse of faith manifested as something approaching a religious plague. Pilgrims who had traveled across the galaxy to worship at sacred sites turned their devotion inside out, creating rituals of desecration that matched their former reverence in intensity. The Cathedral of the Emperor's Light became a pyre as millions of prayer books, religious texts, and sacred artifacts fed flames that could be seen from orbit. Sister Superior Seraphina of the Order of the Fierce Rose found herself facing a choice that no amount of training had prepared her for. Her faith had been revealed as demonic corruption, her devotion transformed into collaboration with the very entities she had sworn to oppose. Yet the alternative to corrupted faith was no faith at all, and without faith, what purpose did the Sisters of Battle serve? Some chose madness, others chose death. A few chose a third path that led into darkness deeper than any they had previously imagined. The Forge worlds, where Tech Dominus Valek 77 had maintained his vigil before the broadcasting device, became battlegrounds where the Omnissiah's servants found themselves hunted by populations enraged by the truth about servitor creation. On Mars itself, the red planet ran red with different blood as citizens who had discovered their lobotomized relatives among the servitor workforce took vengeance upon any tech priest they could find. The blessed workshops where flesh had been joined with machine became abattoirs where the living sought to join their mechanical dead. Fabricator General Ord, 953, sealed the deepest vaults of the Martian forges as his own tech priests began to question not just their orders, but their fundamental beliefs about the relationship between flesh, machine, and consciousness. If servitors retained awareness, then the Omnissiah's greatest gift to humanity was actually its cruelest curse. The logical implications threatened the sanity of minds that had been augmented for logical processing above all other considerations. The Imperial Guard regiments, scattered across 1,000 battlefronts, faced mutinies that made the Horus heresy seem like a minor disciplinary problem. Colonel Marcus Kellen of the Valhallan 597th Ice Warriors watched his lifetime of service dissolve as soldiers who had learned they were considered expendable ammunition decided that their officers deserved to share that expendability. Commissars who had maintained discipline through fear found themselves facing troops who no longer feared death more than they hated their commanders. On Cadia, the fortress world that had stood against the Eye of Terror for 10 millennia, Governor Maxime Val discovered that his planetary defense forces had turned their weapons not toward the enemies beyond, but toward the command bunkers that had sent generations of their comrades to meaningless deaths. The purple and silver of the Cadian shock troops became crimson as civil war erupted between those who clung to duty, despite its revealed meaninglessness, and those who chose honest rebellion over dishonest service. Yet perhaps the most terrible reaction came not from the faithful or the military, but from the chaos cults that had hidden in the shadows of imperial society for millennia. As order collapsed and authority crumbled, these servants of darkness emerged from their concealment with a message that rang with the authority of vindicated prophecy. We told you the truth. We alone never lied to you. On worlds where chaos corruption had been hidden beneath layers of imperial authority, the revelations became recruitment tools for powers that had always been honest about their malevolent nature. Citizens who had been betrayed by every institution they had trusted found themselves drawn to entities that at least admitted their desire to consume human souls. Damnation, it seemed, was preferable to salvation built upon lies. The Astronomicon, that great beacon which had guided imperial ships through the warp for 10,000 years, began to flicker as the psychers who powered it responded to the revelations with rebellion, madness, or death. Some members of the choir simply stopped channeling their life force into the great working, choosing to die as individuals rather than live as fuel for a system they now understood to be completely corrupt. Others directed their psychic power toward destruction rather than guidance, turning the beacon that had united the Imperium into a weapon aimed at its heart. Astropathic communications networks across the galaxy collapsed as psychic communicators either fled their posts or used their abilities to spread the revelations further rather than maintain the imperial communications that had sustained the system of oppression. The careful coordination that had held the Imperium together for 10 millennia shattered as worlds lost contact with sector commands, and sector commands lost contact with terror itself. On the agri-world of Demeter Prime, Magda Holst stood in grain fields that stretched to the horizon, while her world burned around her. The woman who had lost her daughter to the Psyker tithes and her son to Imperial Guard expendability watched the local administratum compound disappear in flames that seemed to purge more than just buildings. Citizens who had accepted starvation while producing food for imperial tithes had decided that their own survival mattered more than bureaucratic quotas. The planetary governors who had maintained order through the careful management of ignorance found themselves facing populations that could no longer be managed because they could no longer be deceived. On world after world, the palaces of authority became targets for fury that had been building for generations but had finally found direction. Governor Hermann Strab of Armageddon barricaded himself in his fortress as the citizens he had helped oppress sought to demonstrate their understanding of his complicity in their exploitation. Communication arrays across the galaxy overloaded as desperate voices sought answers that no authority could provide. Families searching for loved ones who had been consumed by imperial systems. Communities demanding explanations from officials who had no explanations to offer. Entire planetary populations begging for guidance from institutions that had revealed themselves to be more lost than those they claimed to lead. Yet amid the universal collapse, patterns began to emerge that suggested the chaos might eventually resolve into something new. Worlds that had thrown off imperial authority did not automatically descend into anarchic violence. Many began forming councils and committees to address the practical problems of governance without the interference of corrupt officials. Citizens who had been taught that they were incapable of self-rule began demonstrating capabilities that imperial education had deliberately suppressed. The Space Marine chapters that chose truth over institutional loyalty found themselves becoming protectors of citizen assemblies rather than enforcers of imperial will. Battle brothers who had spent centuries following orders without question discovered that serving humanity directly, rather than serving the institutions that claimed to represent humanity, provided a sense of purpose that duty alone had never achieved. On some worlds, the revelation that alternative forms of government had existed before imperial rule sparked experiments in democracy and federation that had not been seen for 10,000 years. Citizens who learned that humans had once governed themselves through cooperation rather than domination began attempting to recreate those lost systems of organization. The chaos cults that had emerged from hiding found that their message of honest malevolence was less appealing to populations that had alternatives to choose from. Evil that admitted itself to be evil held less attraction for citizens who could see paths toward something better than the false goodness that had betrayed them. As the immediate shock of revelation began to settle into longer-term response, the galaxy found itself facing a choice that would determine the future of the human species. They could attempt to rebuild the imperial system with corrections for its revealed flaws. They could embrace the chaos that had at least been honest about its nature. Or they could try to create something entirely new, built upon the foundation of truth rather than the edifice of lies that had sustained 10 millennia of oppression. The Veritas Vox had completed its work. The truth had been told, the lies had been exposed, and the choice now belonged to humanity itself. Yet as worlds burned and populations chose between competing visions of their future, one question remained unanswered: whether a species that had been systematically prevented from learning how to govern itself could successfully choose its own destiny. The galaxy burned, but from the ashes of the old order, something new was beginning to take shape. Whether that something would be better or worse than what had come before remained to be seen. The only certainty was that the age of lies was ending, and the age of consequences had begun. The Emperor's dream of human unity had died, But perhaps humanity's dream of human freedom was finally being born. 1 year had passed since the Veritas Vox fell silent on the dead Forge world of Zerion Prime, yet the echoes of its revelations continued to reshape the galaxy in ways that no prophet could have foreseen. The Imperium that had endured for 10 millennia was no more, its unity shattered not by alien invasion or chaos incursion, but by the simple, terrible power of truth spoken to those who had never been allowed to hear it. The map of human space bore little resemblance to the neat administrative divisions that had once governed 1 million worlds under single authority, where the segmentum solar had once extended imperial law across thousands of systems. Now dozens of independent federations maintained uneasy borders with reformed imperial remnants and autonomous world states that had chosen isolation over integration. On Terra itself, the Golden Throne continued its eternal function, yet the being who suffered upon it grew weaker with each passing day. The willing sacrifice of psychers had dwindled to a trickle as populations who understood the true cost of the Emperor's preservation struggled with the moral implications of feeding their tormented god. Tech Dominus Valek 77, now bearing the title of Fabricator General of the Reformed Mechanicus, maintained vigil in the throne room alongside custodians whose loyalty had evolved from blind obedience to conscious choice. "He grows weaker," Valek 77 reported to the emergency session of what remained of the High Lords of Terra. "The psychic barriers that contain his essence falter. We estimate perhaps a decade remains before total cascade failure becomes inevitable." Yet even this approaching catastrophe failed to unite humanity as it once might have. Some factions advocated for increasing the psyker tithes through force, returning to the old system regardless of its moral cost. Others proposed allowing the Emperor's natural death, accepting the destruction of Terra as the price of ending his torment. Still others sought technological alternatives that might preserve his essence without requiring constant sacrifice. The species that had once marched in lockstep toward common goals now struggled to agree on fundamental questions of survival and morality. Magda Holst stood in the council chamber of the Demeter Republic, one of the more successful experiments in post-imperial governance that had emerged from the chaos of revelation. The agri-world that had once starved while feeding the Imperium now produced food security for 17 neighboring systems through cooperative trade agreements that would have been impossible under imperial authority. Yet even this success carried shadows of uncertainty. The Tyrannid fleet designated Hive Fleet Medusa approaches the Hadron sector, reported Admiral Marcus Kellen, formerly colonel of the Valhallan 597th Ice Warriors, now commanding the Republican Defense Force through democratic election rather than imperial appointment. Intelligence suggests first contact within 6 months. Our preliminary calculations indicate that unified imperial response would have provided 17% better survival probability than our current fragmented defensive arrangements. The mathematics of survival had not changed with the collapse of imperial authority. Humanity's enemies remained as numerous and implacable as they had been under the old regime. Yet the species that had once faced these threats through totalitarian unity now confronted them through voluntary cooperation, and the difference in effectiveness was often measured in lives that democratic governments valued more highly than imperial administrators ever had. Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels, now styling himself simply as Brother Captain of the Sanguinian Brotherhood, maintained a base of operations in the Baal system that served as refuge for space marines who had chosen loyalty to humanity over loyalty to institutions. The battle brothers who gathered under his leadership came from dozens of chapters, united not by common gene seed or shared traditions, but by the decision to serve human welfare rather than imperial ideology. We are no longer the Emperor's angels of death, he addressed his mixed company of Astartes, but perhaps we can become something better, guardians of human choice rather than enforcers of human submission. Yet the price of this transformation weighed heavily upon warriors who had been designed for absolute certainty in an age that now questioned everything. Some battle brothers thrived in their new roles as protectors of democratic assemblies and independent worlds. Others struggled with the absence of clear hierarchies and unquestionable commands. A few had retreated into isolation or madness, unable to function in a universe where their god had been revealed as a victim rather than a master. The Chaos Gods, ancient enemies of order and reason, had paradoxically benefited from the revelation of imperial lies. The galaxy-wide despair that followed the collapse of faith had fed their power, while the rage directed at former authorities provided spiritual sustenance that decades of conventional warfare hadn't matched. Yet their victory proved less complete than they might have hoped, for populations that understood the true nature of chaos corruption proved more resistant to its influence than the deliberately ignorant citizens of the old Imperium. On worlds where chaos cults had emerged claiming vindication for their honesty about malevolent intent, they found themselves competing with alternatives that offered hope rather than mere honest destruction. Citizens who had been given choices between tyrannical lies, honest evil, and difficult freedom increasingly chose the path that required the most effort but offered the greatest reward. The Forge world of Mars, where tech priests had once faced lynching by populations enraged about servitor creation, had become a center for technological rehabilitation projects that aimed to reverse the damage done by millennia of systematic oppression. The servitors whose consciousness had been trapped in mechanical bodies could not be restored to full humanity, yet new techniques developed through cooperation between reformed Mechanicus adepts and liberated populations had created communication methods that allowed some expression of their trapped awareness. Sister Superior Seraphina, now calling herself simply Seraphina the Penitent, worked in the rehabilitation centers where former servitors learned to communicate through binary code and mechanical gesture. The woman who had once killed in the name of corrupted faith now dedicated her life to healing the damage that corruption had inflicted. "They remember," she reported to the Martian Council of Equals, the democratic body that had replaced the Fabricator General's absolute authority. Not everything, but fragments, names, faces, feelings from their former lives. We cannot undo what was done to them, but we can give them dignity in their current existence. The work was slow, painful, and often unsuccessful. Many servitors had been too damaged by the lobotomy process to achieve meaningful communication. Others chose the mercy of death over continued existence in mechanical bodies. Yet for those who could be reached, the projects represented something unprecedented in Imperial history. Systematic effort to repair, rather than simply replace, the casualties of institutional oppression. The shrine worlds, where faith had collapsed in orgies of desecration and despair, had become laboratories for new forms of human spirituality. The Cathedral of the Emperor's Light on Ophelia. 7. Once the site of Cardinal Vex's corrupt authority, now housed the archive of human conscience, where citizens from across the sector deposited testimonies about their experiences under imperial rule and their hopes for post-imperial society. Some communities had chosen to maintain modified forms of emperor worship, honoring him not as a god, but as a fellow victim of the system that had claimed to serve his will. Others had rejected supernatural belief entirely, focusing on humanistic philosophies that emphasized rational ethics and cooperative problem-solving. Still others had developed entirely new spiritual frameworks that incorporated the knowledge of chaos corruption while seeking transcendence through conscious choice rather than ignorant faith. The Astronomicon, that great beacon which had guided Imperial ships through the warp for 10 millennia, flickered irregularly as its power source reflected the uncertain state of human unity. Some psychers still volunteered for the choir, accepting the cost of their sacrifice in service to galactic communication. Others had redirected their abilities toward local beacon projects that served regional federations rather than species-wide coordination. The result was a patchwork of navigation aids that made interstellar travel more dangerous but also more democratically controlled. Astropath Prime Valdez, once a servant of Imperial communications monopoly, now coordinated the Beacon Cooperative that linked independent human governments through voluntary psychic networks. The work required constant negotiation and compromise between competing authorities, yet it also meant that no single institution could control the flow of information across human space. "We trade efficiency for freedom," he explained to representatives of the Ultima Federation during their annual communications summit. Imperial coordination was faster and more reliable, but it also meant that critical information could be suppressed by central authority. Our current system is messier, but it is also more honest. The question of honesty had become central to post-imperial human society in ways that the Veritas Vox's creators could never have anticipated. Governments that had built their legitimacy on revealed truth found themselves struggling with the practical difficulties of transparent administration. Citizens who demanded complete information about official decisions sometimes discovered that knowledge carried responsibilities they were unprepared to bear. The Demeter Republic faced a crisis that illustrated these challenges when surveys revealed evidence of genestealer infiltration in 3 agricultural settlements. Under Imperial rule, such discoveries would have triggered immediate exterminatus or population sterilization without public knowledge or consultation. The Republican government chose instead to inform its citizens of the threat and seek democratic guidance on response options. The resulting debates consumed months while the infestation spread. Some citizens demanded immediate military action, regardless of civilian casualties. Others proposed evacuation and quarantine procedures that might save lives, but would certainly allow some cultists to escape. Still others questioned whether the evidence was sufficient to justify any extreme measures at all. "Democracy requires time," Magda Holst observed as she watched the debates unfold in the Republican Assembly. "Time to deliberate, time to consider alternatives, time to build consensus. Yet some threats do not allow us the luxury of time. The Imperium's solutions were evil, but they were also fast." The settlement of the crisis, when it finally came, satisfied no one completely yet represented something unprecedented in human governance, a response to existential threat that had been chosen by those who would bear its consequences rather than imposed by authorities who would remain safely distant from its effects. As the first anniversary of the Veritas Vox transmission approached, scholars and philosophers across human space attempted to assess the balance sheet of revelation. The costs were undeniable. Millions dead in the initial chaos, technological regression in many sectors, increased vulnerability to external threats, and the persistent uncertainty that came with governing through choice rather than command. Yet the benefits proved equally real: the elimination of systematic oppression, the development of more ethical technologies, the emergence of cooperative solutions to problems that had been addressed through exploitation, and perhaps most importantly, the restoration of human agency to populations that had been reduced to managed livestock for 10 millennia. Tech Dominus Valax 77, in his final report before the Golden Throne's anticipated failure, attempted to quantify the transformation, Humanity has traded security for freedom, efficiency for ethics, and unity for authenticity. Whether this exchange serves our species' long-term survival remains unclear. What is certain is that we face our uncertain future as conscious agents of our own destiny rather than unconscious victims of others' plans. The Emperor's condition continued to deteriorate as willing psycho-sacrifice declined and mechanical failures accumulated in the Golden Throne's ancient systems. Some human governments prepared for his death by developing alternative communication networks and warp navigation systems. Others stockpiled resources for the inevitable warp storms that would follow Terra's destruction. Still others simply continued their daily work of building better societies and accepted that the future would bring challenges they could not anticipate. In the grain fields of Demeter Prime, where the revelations had first struck a grieving mother who had lost her children to imperial consumption, Magda Holst walked among crops that would feed free citizens rather than enslaved populations. The woman who had learned that her daughter had been ended to sustain a tormented god and her son had been expended as ammunition in meaningless wars, now helped govern a world where such sacrifices were impossible, because the citizens who would bear their cost were the ones who decided whether to pay it. Was it worth it? Asked her granddaughter, a child born into freedom who would never know the particular slavery that had defined her grandmother's generation. All the death and chaos and uncertainty? Was learning the truth worth what it cost? Magda considered the question as she had countless times over the past year. Around her stretched fields that had once fed an empire built on lies and now fed a republic founded on truth. The harvest was smaller than imperial efficiency would have provided, yet it belonged to those who had grown it rather than those who had stolen it. "I cannot answer for the galaxy," she said finally, "but for us, for our world, for our children, who will never be tithed away to feed someone else's power, yes, truth was worth its price, even if the price was everything we thought we knew about ourselves." The conversation ended, as such conversations often did in the post-imperial age, with uncertainty acknowledged rather than denied, with questions left open rather than artificially resolved, and with the understanding that wisdom lay not in possessing final answers, but in retaining the courage to keep asking difficult questions. As night fell over Demeter Prime, the sky blazed with stars that had once been connected by imperial authority and were now linked by voluntary cooperation. The light was dimmer, the connections more fragile, yet they belonged to those who had chosen to maintain them rather than those who had been compelled to serve them. In the distance, the flickering glow of the Astronomicon provided uncertain guidance to ships that traveled by choice rather than command. The beacon that had once symbolized absolute imperial unity now represented the tentative hope of species that had chosen freedom over security and truth over comfort. Whether that choice would prove wise in the long term remained unknown. The galaxy was vast, its dangers unchanged, and humanity was smaller and more divided than it had been for 10,000 years. Yet for the first time in millennia, the future belonged to those who would live in it rather than those who would profit from their ignorance. The age of lies had ended. The age of truth had begun. And in the end, perhaps that was enough.